By July 1943, the steppe south of Kursk had already been measured in artillery range tables and fuel allotments long before a single engine turned over. The III SS Panzer Division Totenkopf formed part of the II SS Panzer Corps, assigned to the southern thrust of Operation Citadel. The objective was direct and mechanical: break through Soviet defensive belts, advance north toward Prokhorovka, and collide with German forces attacking from the opposite flank to encircle formations numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Totenkopf entered the offensive with thousands of men and dozens of armored vehicles, including Panzer IV tanks weighing roughly 25 tons and heavier Tiger tanks exceeding 45 tons. Each Tiger carried frontal armor several inches thick and fired 88mm shells weighing over 20 pounds. Each tank consumed fuel measured not in gallons but in tons over sustained operations. The Soviet defenses awaiting them did not rely on a single trench line. They extended across belts measured in miles, reinforced with anti-tank ditches, wire, and over 1 million mines distributed across the salient. Artillery batteries were positioned in depth, firing shells weighing 15 to 20 pounds in overlapping arcs. Infantry divisions waited in staggered formations, backed by reserve tank armies capable of committing hundreds of vehicles in counterstroke. When Totenkopf advanced, its armored columns fractured against minefields before encountering direct fire. Recovery vehicles hauled disabled tanks weighing over 40 tons from cratered ground. Engineers cleared lanes under artillery bombardment. Progress registered in yards. Casualty reports accumulated daily. In certain battalions, effective combat strength eroded by more than 20% within the first week of fighting. Inside a Tiger tank pressing forward near the Psel River, the hull shuddered as the main gun discharged. The turret traversed slowly, gears grinding under stress. Through the periscope, the commander saw Soviet T-34 tanks maneuvering across wheat fields, their 30-ton frames absorbing hits or burning under impact. Heat built inside the compartment. Sweat collected beneath leather headgear as the crew calculated range and ammunition remaining. The southern pincer achieved initial penetration deeper than the northern attack. Totenkopf pushed toward Prokhorovka, engaging Soviet armored reserves in clashes at distances often measured in less than 100 yards. At that range, armor thickness and gun caliber mattered, but so did positioning and rate of fire. Reports from July 12 described dozens of tanks disabled in hours. The battlefield filled with steel hulls, some intact but immobilized, others ruptured and smoking. When I examined divisional strength returns from early July alongside those filed after the engagement near Prokhorovka, the arithmetic hardened. Dozens of armored vehicles were destroyed or disabled. Replacement crews were limited. Fuel deliveries struggled to maintain tempo as Allied bombing campaigns targeted rail nodes farther west. Every mile advanced required additional tonnage of gasoline, ammunition, and spare parts. Strategically, the offensive stalled not solely because of tactical resistance, but because Soviet defense in depth absorbed initial blows and counterattacked with reserves measured in hundreds of tanks and tens of thousands of infantry. Totenkopf and its sister divisions could punch through initial lines, but sustaining that breach demanded reserves Germany no longer possessed in sufficient depth. Mechanical strain compounded battlefield attrition. Panther tanks in other formations suffered engine fires and transmission failures. Even Tigers, formidable in frontal engagements, were vulnerable to mines and flanking fire. A disabled vehicle weighing over 45 tons was not easily recovered under continuous artillery bombardment. By mid-July, higher command recalibrated. Allied landings in Sicily forced redistribution of resources. Operation Citadel was halted. Soviet forces transitioned to counteroffensive operations that pushed German lines backward across hundreds of miles over subsequent months. Totenkopf withdrew, its ranks thinned, its armor inventory reduced. The division's record at Kursk cannot be isolated from its broader history, including prior campaigns marked by both combat effectiveness and documented atrocities in occupied territories. Military analysis demands acknowledgement of both battlefield performance and conduct beyond the front line. For the men inside those armored hulls in July heat, The battle condensed to vibration and concussion. Shell impacts rang against steel measured in inches. Mines detonated beneath tracks. Radios crackled with reports of breakthroughs that soon stalled under counterfire. Dust settled briefly before the next barrage erupted. If you are listening now, perhaps in the quiet stretch before sleep, imagine that wide expanse of steppe under a fading sun. Smoke drifting over fields where armored columns once advanced yard by yard. Engines that roared hours earlier now sit silent. The heat lifts slowly from metal surfaces. Let that image cool the noise of the day. This is the entire history of the 3rd SS Totenkopf at Kursk. Chapter 1. The Personnel File. The 16th of October, 1939. A processing hall somewhere in the administrative complex at Dachau, Upper Bavaria. Not the camp itself, not the barracks or the wire, but the building next door, the one with the filing cabinets. The room smells of carbon paper and fresh ink ribbons. A clerk is typing transfer orders. He's been at it since morning, working through a stack of personnel cards. The SS Stammkarte, a standard form roughly the size of a man's open hand, printed on heavy cream stock with pre-filled categories running down the left margin. Name, date of birth, blood type, party membership number, civilian occupation. There is no field, and I want you to hold this fact because it matters more than anything else in this chapter. There is no field for duties performed at previous assignment. The card asks a man where he served. It does not ask what he did there. That silence, built into the design of a form, is where this story begins. The division being assembled that autumn, the one we now call the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, did not spring from the regular German military. It wasn't carved from existing army formations or built around a cadre of professional officers in the conventional sense. Its founding personnel came overwhelmingly from the SS Totenkopfverbände, the Death's Head units, the concentration camp guard formations that had operated the sprawling system of detention, forced labor, and murder that Himmler's SS had built across the Reich since 1933. The man who designed that system, who wrote its punishment codes and standardized its cruelties from Dachau to Sachsenhausen to Buchenwald, was also the man assembling this division. His name was Theodor Eicke. He was a former police paymaster, a psychiatric patient, committed to a facility in Würzburg in the early 1930s before Himmler retrieved him, and, by October 1939, one of the most powerful men in the SS apparatus. Eicke didn't merely command the Totenkopf, he invented it, and the personnel he used to build it carried something with them that no transfer order could erase. When I was cross-referencing the known personnel rosters with the camp assignment records available through the Bundesarchive, the overlap was staggering. Approximately 6,500 of the division's initial 15,362 men were direct transfers from the concentration camp guard service. That's 42.3%. Not a fringe element, not a contamination, nearly half the division. The institutional genealogy matters because it shaped everything that followed. The internal discipline, the command culture, the relationship between officers and enlisted men, and the division's posture toward enemy soldiers and civilians. Eicke had codified the camp system's punishment regime as early as 1933, when he issued what became known as the Lagerordnung at Dachau, a set of regulations that authorized graduated physical abuse for infractions as minor as improperly folding a blanket. The specific language prescribed 25 strokes for categories of disobedience that a regular army would have handled with extra duty or a verbal reprimand. This was not military discipline adapted to a harsh environment. It was something else entirely, a framework in which human degradation was procedural, bureaucratic, and normalized. The men who enforced these rules for years didn't suddenly become different people when they were issued rifles and Feldgrau uniforms. They carried the Lagerordnung in their habits, in their reflexes, in the way they understood authority and obedience. Charles Sydnor's 1977 study, Soldiers of Destruction, remains the most thorough examination of this continuity. And while subsequent scholarship has added nuance, not every Totenkopf soldier served in the camps, and the division did receive replacements from the general SS manpower pool as the war progressed. Sydnor's central finding has never been overturned. The organizational DNA was set at founding. The Wehrmacht knew what was being assembled.
The Heerespersonalamt, the Army Personnel Office, filed formal objections to the redesignation of camp guard units as combat troops. The surviving records in the Militär Archive at Freiburg indicate that Army officials questioned whether SS Totenkopfverbände personnel had received tactical training adequate for field deployment. The language was bureaucratic, not moral. The Army's concern was competence, not ethics, but the objection was real. Eicke's response, communicated to Himmler and surviving only as paraphrased summaries in Himmler's desk diary, claimed his men had completed training equivalent to standard infantry. They had not conducted company-level field exercises, live-fire maneuvers, or combined arms coordination. The gap between Eicke's claims and the Army's assessment is one of the first source conflicts in the Totenkopf's documentary record, and it established a pattern that would recur throughout the division's history. Official SS reports consistently overstated the formation's readiness, while external assessments were more measured. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between, but closer to the Army's skepticism than to Eicke's boasts. What happened next confirmed the worst fears about the division's character, though not in the way the Wehrmacht had predicted. The Army worried about tactical incompetence. What materialized was something darker. On the 27th of May, 1940, during the Battle of France, men of the Totenkopf Division, specifically the 2nd SS Infantry Regiment, under the command of Fritz Knocklein, committed what became known as the Le Paradis Massacre. 97 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, who had surrendered after a fierce defensive action, were lined up against the wall of a barn and shot. 2 men survived, Privates Albert Pooley and William O'Callaghan, concealed beneath the bodies of their comrades. Their sworn affidavits, given after the war, formed the basis of Knocklein's prosecution and execution. I want to be precise about what this event tells us and what it doesn't. It doesn't tell us that every man in the Totenkopf was a murderer. It does tell us that the organizational culture Eicke had built, a culture in which the boundary between enemy and prisoner was deliberately blurred, in which violence against the defenseless was not an aberration but a feature, could produce exactly this outcome under the stress of combat. And it would not be the last time. Eicke led the division through the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 and into the nightmare of the Demyansk pocket in the winter of 41 to 42, where the Totenkopf was trapped for months in frozen, encircled positions south of Leningrad. The casualties were enormous. The division lost thousands of men to combat, cold, and disease, and Eicke's leadership during this period cemented his reputation within the SS as a commander who would hold ground regardless of cost. The survivors of Demyansk became the hardcore of the division's veteran cadre, and they carried with them both the tactical experience of extended defensive combat and the psychological scarring of prolonged encirclement. By early 1943, the division had been withdrawn, refitted, and redesignated as an SS Panzer Grenadier Division, receiving tanks and mechanized equipment that transformed it from an infantry formation into a combined arms force. But Eicke would not lead it into its most critical battle. On the 26th of February, 1943, his Fiesler Storch observation aircraft was shot down near Orelka, behind Soviet lines. He was killed. The man who had built the camps, built the division, and stamped his personality onto both was gone, and now someone else would have to take what he'd created and drive it into the fire. That someone was Hermann Priess, an SS officer of a different temperament than Eicke, less flamboyant, more conventionally military in his bearing. Priess assumed command of a division that was, in many ways, still Eicke's creation. The internal culture, the NCO Corps drawn from camp veterans, the specific blend of ideological fervor and brutal pragmatism. These were institutional features, not personal ones, and they didn't change with the nameplate on the commander's door.
It fascinates me how often Psel is overlooked in the secondary literature, overshadowed by Eike's larger-than-life reputation and by the more famous commanders of the Leibstandarte and Das Reich. But Psel was the man who actually led the Totenkopf at Kursk, and his operational decisions during the Psel River crossing and the bridgehead fighting would determine the division's fate in its most important engagement. He inherited a tool that had been designed by a concentration camp commandant. He would wield it as a military instrument. That this distinction may be meaningless, that the tool itself was shaped by its origin, regardless of who held it, is one of the central tensions of this entire story. The spring of 1943 found the Totenkopf in the aftermath of the Third Battle of Kursk, that remarkable German counteroffensive in which Manstein's forces recaptured the city in March after the catastrophe of Stalingrad had seemed to portend the collapse of the entire southern front. The division had fought hard during the Kharkov battles, and it now entered a period of rest and refitting in the rear areas. New equipment arrived. Panzer IV Ausführung G tanks, fresh from the factories, still smelling of paint and machine oil. Replacement personnel came from the SS training depot at Debicka in occupied Poland, young men who had never seen the Eastern Front and who were joining a formation whose veterans had survived Demyansk, Le Paradis, and 2 years of grinding combat. The Feldpost collection at Freiburg preserves fragments of the letters these men wrote home during the spring lull. One private, I won't invent his name because the letter survives only in a censorship summary, not in original form, described the new tanks arriving on flat cars at the railhead, noting that the factory paint was still tacky in the April sun. There's something in that detail, the smell of fresh paint on a machine designed for killing, received by men whose previous professional experience included guarding concentration camp inmates, that captures the Totenkopf's essential duality better than any analytical framework I could construct. And this brings us to the question that will carry through the rest of this documentary. Eike was dead, his camps were still running, his division was being handed new tanks and new men and pointed toward the biggest battle of the Eastern Front. How much of what he had built, the discipline structure, the dehumanization protocols, the specific organizational reflex that treated human beings as administrative problems to be processed, survived in the habits and SOPs of a formation that no longer bore his living imprint, but was still, in every functional sense, his creation? The SS Stammkarte, that personnel card with the missing field, offers one answer. It suggests that the institutional design was deliberate. By not asking what a man did at his previous assignment, the form ensured that the answer could never appear in the record. The absence of the question was the architecture of deniability, built into a piece of cardstock. When we talk about institutional memory, a concept that modern transitional justice scholars now apply to organizations that commit atrocities, asking how criminal behavior persists through personnel changes and leadership turnover. We are asking a question that the Totenkopf's own paperwork was specifically designed to prevent anyone from answering. The division that rolled toward the Kursk salient in the early summer of 1943 was, on paper, a formidable military formation, approximately 15,000 men, over 160 tanks and assault guns, organic artillery, pioneers, reconnaissance elements, and the logistical tail required to sustain a mechanized division in sustained combat operations. It was part of Paul Hauser's II SS Panzer Corps, alongside the 1st SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and the 2nd SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Das Reich. Three of the most powerful formations the German military possessed, concentrated for a single operation. But the paper strength concealed a harder question that no table of organization could answer. What kind of men were inside those tanks? What had they done before? And did it matter? The institutional answer, encoded in a form with a missing field, was, don't ask. The historical answer, written in the records of Le Paradis and Demyansk and the camps, was, yes, it mattered. It always mattered. And it would matter again, on the banks of a river called the Psel in 12 days' time. Chapter 2. The Inventory. The 4th of July, 1943. Not a holiday in this part of the world. a map table in the Totenkopf's divisional headquarters, somewhere in the rear assembly area south of Belgorod, in what is now eastern Ukraine. The table is covered with typed forms, equipment returns, ammunition allocation sheets, fuel calculations, weighed down at the corners with shell casings repurposed as paperweights. An officer is going through the numbers. His name, in this case, is less important than his function. He is the man responsible for knowing exactly what the division can field when the order comes. And the order is coming. Everyone knows it. Operation Citadel, the German offensive against the Kursk salient, the operation that had been postponed and debated and agonized over for months, is 24 hours away. The question on this table, rendered in columns of typed figures, is not whether the division will attack, it is what it will attack with. The document at the center of this chapter is the IST Starka Equipment Return, the actual strength report, filed by the III SS Panzer Regiment for the 4th of July, 1943. It survives in microfilm form in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, on reel T354, and it is one of the most granular snapshots we have of any German armored formation on the eve of Kursk. I want to walk through it slowly, because every line contains a story, and several lines contain problems that the popular histories have never addressed. The count begins with the Panzer III's, 59 Panzer III longs, meaning the variant armed with the 5-centimeter KWK-39 gun with the longer 60-caliber barrel. 8 Panzer III command variants, fitted with additional radio equipment and reduced ammunition stowage to accommodate the extra electronics. 7 Panzer IV shorts, and here the first anomaly appears. The Panzer IV short, armed with the low-velocity 75mm KWK-37, was an obsolete vehicle by mid-1943. It had been the standard German medium tank in 1940 and 41, but by the time of Kursk, the short-barreled 75 couldn't reliably penetrate the frontal armor of a T-34 at combat ranges. These 7 tanks should not have been there. They were holdovers from the Kharkov refitting, vehicles that no one had bothered to send back to the depot or exchange for current production models. 7 crews would drive them into battle the next morning, knowing they were carrying a 1941 answer to a 1943 problem. The count continues. 40 Panzer IV longs, the Ausführung G, armed with the high-velocity 75mm KWK-40 with the 48-caliber barrel, a genuinely effective anti-tank weapon capable of defeating a T-34 at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. This was the division's primary fighting tank, the vehicle that would do most of the killing and most of the dying in the days ahead. Then 11 Tiger Ones and 1 Tiger Command variant in the 9th Heavy Company of the regiment. The Tigers had been received in February 43, and by the eve of Kursk, they had already consumed enormous quantities of spare parts during the Kharkov fighting and the subsequent refitting period. The Maybach HL-230 engine's susceptibility to overheating in dusty conditions was a known problem. Every Tiger crew understood that their vehicle was as likely to be defeated by its own power plant as by a Soviet anti-tank gun. 28 Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns, the low-profile turretless armored fighting vehicles that served as infantry support and anti-tank platforms. 11 Martyr. 2 tank destroyers, open-topped, thinly armored vehicles mounting the 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun on a Panzer II chassis. And then, almost invisible in the ledger, but critical to understanding the numbers that historians have used for decades, 5 Panzer III Beobachtungswagen, observation tanks, stripped of their main armament, carrying only a dummy gun barrel, used exclusively for artillery forward observation. These 5 vehicles could not fire a shot. They appear in every aggregate tank strength figure published in the secondary literature. They are, functionally, unarmed. When I was compiling the weight calculations for the division's armored component, the arithmetic produced a figure that stopped me. Approximately 4,762 metric tons of steel rolling toward the start line. I reached this by multiplying individual vehicle weights, roughly 23 tons for a Panzer III, 25 for a Panzer IV, 57 for a Tiger, 23.9 for a Stug 3, 10.8 for a Marder 2, against the vehicle count and summing. It's an imperfect calculation because combat-loaded weights varied with ammunition and fuel states, but it's close enough to illustrate a point that pure vehicle counts obscure. Every one of those tons had to cross the same terrain. Every one had to use the same roads, the same bridges, the same river crossings. The 60-ton bridge that the division's pioneers would later construct over the Psel River was rated to carry exactly one Tiger at a time. A 57-ton vehicle on a 60-ton rated bridge leaves a margin of 3 tons. 3 tons. 5%. In structural engineering, that's not a safety margin. That's a prayer. And every Tiger in the 9th Company would cross that bridge, one at a time, while Soviet artillery searched for the range. The Tiger question deserves particular attention because it sits at the intersection of military reality and cultural mythology. The Tiger I was, by any measure, a formidable weapons system. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun could defeat any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, and its 100mm frontal armor was essentially immune to the Soviet 76.2mm gun at normal combat distances. But the Tiger was also a maintenance catastrophe. It weighed 57 tons, roughly twice the weight of a Panzer IV, which meant it devoured fuel at prodigious rates. Approximately 540 liters per 100 kilometers on roads, and north of 700 liters cross-country. Its Maybach engine, the HL-230P45, generated 700 horsepower but ran at thermal limits in sustained operation, particularly in the summer heat of the steppe. The Henschel suspension, with its overlapping road wheels, the so-called Schachtelhoff work, was an engineering marvel for ride quality, but a maintenance horror. Replacing an inner road wheel required removing several outer wheels first, a process that could consume hours. And then there's the specific anomaly in the Totenkopf's records. The regimental maintenance officer's report for the 4th of July, surviving in fragmentary form, lists 10 operational Tigers. The divisional daily report records 11. 1 tank. 1 discrepancy. It sounds trivial. It isn't. A company of 10 Tigers organizes into 3 platoons of 3 with 1 command tank. A company of 11 allows a platoon of 3 with a spare. The tactical geometry of the formation changes. And when post-war historians cite 11 Tigers as the Totenkopf's heavy company strength at Kursk, they are choosing one source over another without always acknowledging the choice. To me, the most telling detail in the entire equipment return isn't the Tigers or the Panzer IVs, it's the ammunition allocation. A Panzer IV long carried 87 rounds of 75mm KWK-40 ammunition in internal stowage. A Tiger carried 92 rounds of 88mm. The II SS Panzer Corps logistics annex to the Citadel operations order prescribed expected consumption rates for the first 48 hours. These rates were based on combat experience from Kharkov, adjusted upward for the anticipated density of Soviet defenses. But consumption rates are estimates, and estimates are wrong. They're wrong in predictable ways. They undercount because staff officers who set ammunition allocations have an institutional incentive to appear efficient. And they're wrong in unpredictable ways because the actual intensity of combat never matches the planning assumption. What the 4th of July ammunition allocation tells us is not how many rounds each tank would fire. It tells us how many rounds each tank would have when the allocation ran out, which is to say, 0. The distance between a tank with 87 rounds and a tank with 0 rounds is not measured in kilometers. It's measured in hours. The fuel equation compounds the problem. The Totenkopf's quartermaster had to balance the fuel requirements of the entire division. Not just the Panzer Regiment, but the Panzer Grenadier battalions in their half-tracks, the artillery in their self-propelled mounts, the reconnaissance elements in their armored cars, the supply trucks, the recovery vehicles, the field kitchens. The Tiger's fuel consumption established the operational ceiling for the entire formation, because the thirstiest vehicle determines the range of the whole. At 700 liters per 100 kilometers cross-country, the 9th Company's 12 Tigers consumed roughly 8,400 liters, or 8.4 cubic meters, of fuel for every 100 kilometers of advance. This was fuel that could not be allocated to the Panzer IVs or the half-tracks. The Tiger, in this sense, was not just a weapon. It was a tax on the entire division's mobility. When I was cross-referencing the fuel allocation with the distance to the Psel River, roughly 40 kilometers from the start line, the arithmetic suggested that the Tigers would arrive at the river with less than half their internal fuel capacity remaining, assuming moderate cross-country conditions. They did arrive. They were thirsty. The Martyr IIs deserve a paragraph of their own, because they represent the other end of the spectrum from the Tiger. Not the exquisite, expensive, over-engineered behemoth, but the cheap, expedient, good-enough solution that the German war economy produced in growing numbers as the conflict consumed resources faster than industry could replace them. The Martyr II mounted a perfectly adequate 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun on the hull of an obsolescent Panzer II light tank. The gun could kill a T-34 at ranges exceeding a kilometer. The problem was everything around the gun. The fighting compartment was open-topped, with only a thin gun shield and low armored walls protecting the crew from the front and sides. There was no overhead protection. A mortar round landing within 20 meters of a Martyr II could kill or wound the entire crew without penetrating any armor at all. Blast and fragmentation did the work. The men assigned to these vehicles knew what they were driving. The crew survivability differential between a Martyr II and a fully enclosed Panzer IV was not a statistic they needed to look up. They could see it in the configuration of their own vehicle. Standing in an open metal box, exposed from the waist up, behind a gun that could not traverse fast enough to track a flanking target. 11 of these vehicles were on the Totenkopf strength return for the 4th of July. By the 13th of July, 9 days later, only 2 remained operational. The highest percentage loss of any vehicle type in the division. The final line of the equipment return that warrants attention is one that no popular history of Kursk has, to my knowledge, ever discussed in detail: the crew readiness assessment. A tank without a trained crew is not a tank. It's a steel box. The 3rd SS Panzer Regiment received replacement crews during the spring refitting from the SS training depot at Debicka in occupied Poland, and these men had undergone approximately 12 weeks of armored vehicle instruction, driving, gunnery, radio procedure, basic maintenance. 12 weeks. Compare that to the veteran crews who had survived Demyansk, Kharkov, and 2 years of Eastern Front combat. The gap was not simply one of skill, it was one of reflex. A veteran crew could identify a Soviet anti-tank position by the pattern of muzzle dust on the horizon before the first round arrived. A replacement crew could identify it by the impact on their hull. The distinction was approximately 2 seconds of reaction time. At combat speeds and engagement ranges, 2 seconds was the difference between traversing the turret to engage and never traversing the turret again. The equipment return tells us what the division had. It does not tell us what the division could do with it. Those are different questions, and only the battle would answer the second one. The Totenkopf stood at 165 armored fighting vehicles on the evening of the 4th of July, 1943. But if you subtract the 5 unarmed observation tanks, the number drops to 160. If you account for the 7 obsolete Panzer IV shorts, whose combat utility against Soviet armor was marginal at best, the effective anti-armor strength drops further. If you factor in the 12-week replacement crews, the mechanical fragility of the Tigers, the fuel constraints, and the ammunition consumption assumptions that would prove optimistic, the real fighting power of the division was something less than any single number could capture. Ben Wheatley's archival work, beginning in 2019, started the process of separating combat-capable vehicles from administrative presence vehicles in the strength returns of every SS division at Kursk, and his findings have quietly shifted the numerical foundation of the battle's entire historiography downward. The Totenkopf did not enter Kursk with 165 tanks, It entered with 165 entries on a ledger. The difference between a ledger entry and a fighting tank would be written in breakdown reports, repair logs, and casualty returns over the next 12 days. The clerk's column is neat. The reality never is. Chapter 3. The Sapper's Cigarette Break. The night of the 4th of July, 1943, zero dark. Somewhere forward of the Totenkopf's main line of departure, south of Belgorod. The sky is overcast, not the dramatic clouds of a painting, just a flat, dull ceiling that mutes the stars and makes the darkness feel close. In this darkness, men are on their stomachs. They are not tank crews. They are not officers studying maps. They are pioneers, combat engineers, the men with wire cutters and bayonets and a particular kind of courage that doesn't fit easily into the vocabulary of armored warfare. They are crawling toward the Soviet mine belts. The offensive begins tomorrow morning. It cannot begin at all until these men, on their bellies, in the dark, create the lanes through which 4,700 tons of German armor will pass. Every documentary about Kursk starts with the tanks. This one starts with the men who made the tanks' advance possible, because without them, the panzers would have died in the first 500 meters. The SS Pioneer Battalion 3's War Diary for the 4th of July records a supply draw at 14:30 hours. 340 Tellermine deactivation tools, 12,000 meters of marking tape, white, and 87 Bangalore torpedoes. These are the tools of the trade. The deactivation tools were essentially specialized wrenches designed to unscrew the fuse assemblies from Soviet anti-tank mines without triggering the detonation mechanism. The marking tape, white on the left edge of the cleared lane, red on the right, was the only guide the tank drivers would have in the pre-dawn darkness the next morning. A deviation of 3 meters from the taped lane meant a mine strike. The Bangalore torpedoes were tubular explosive charges, each roughly 1.5 meters long, designed to be shoved under wire entanglements and detonated to blow a gap. Beneath this typed supply entry, someone, likely the battalion adjutant, based on the handwriting style, penciled a margin note. It reads, Dritte Kompanie meldet 2 Mann zum Feldscher abgestellt. Third Company reports 2 men detached to the field surgeon. Before the battle has even started, before a single mine has been probed. 2 men who could not face the crawl. The German military medical system in 1943 did not formally categorize combat stress reactions. There was no diagnostic code for what later generations would call acute anxiety, combat fatigue, or post-traumatic stress. The 2 men detached to the field surgeon would have been recorded in the personnel returns as sick, Kranken gemeldet, a classification that carried stigma in an SS formation built on the mythology of superhuman will. Their names, if they were recorded anywhere, would have appeared on a medical log that I have not been able to locate in the surviving records. They disappeared into the paperwork. But the penciled margin note, the fact that the adjutant thought it worth recording at all, suggests he found it unusual. In a battalion about to crawl into a minefield, 2 men saying, "I can't," was notable enough to annotate. I don't know what happened to those 2 men. I don't know if they returned to duty, were transferred to a rear area assignment, or were punished under the savage disciplinary code that Eike's Totenkopf still enforced. What I know is that on the night of the 4th of July, in a unit full of men steeling themselves to probe for mines with bayonets, 2 of them broke before the work began. And someone wrote it down in pencil. The mine belts they were crawling toward represented one of the most concentrated defensive engineering efforts in military history. The Soviet defensive preparations around the Kursk salient had been underway since March, and the mine density in the Totenkopf's assault sector was staggering. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps Intelligence Annex, based on aerial photography, identified 3 belts of anti-tank mines forward of the division's line of departure. Estimated density, roughly 1,500 mines per kilometer of front. But estimates are not reality. The actual density encountered was higher, and here we encounter one of the chapter's source conflicts. The Corps Intelligence Assessment counted 3 belts. The Pioneer Battalion's own after-action report, written after the event, references 4. A Soviet engineer captured on the 6th of July during interrogation recorded in the Corps intelligence log, stated that 5 belts had been laid in the sector. 3 assessments, 3 different numbers. The true figure, which would determine how many mines the pioneers needed to find and neutralize before the first tank could roll forward, was unknown to the men doing the crawling. They were operating on the 3-belt estimate. The mines didn't care about the estimate. The specific mine they were looking for was the Soviet TM-42, a rectangular pressed steel casing 340 millimeters long by 220 millimeters wide by 132 millimeters deep, containing 5.4 kilograms of TNT. The activation pressure was approximately 200 kilograms, enough to prevent infantry from detonating it on foot, but well within the ground pressure of any armored vehicle. 5.4 kilograms of TNT was sufficient to blow a track off a Panzer IV, immobilize a Tiger, or destroy a Marder II outright. The standard German detection tool was the Minensuchgerät 42, an electronic mine detector capable of locating a TM-42 at a maximum depth of 30 centimeters in dry soil. But the steppe soil on the 4th of July had been rain-dampened earlier in the week. Moisture in the soil reduces the detector's effective range by up to 40%. This is not a detail you'll find in most Kursk narratives, because most Kursk narratives don't discuss soil moisture. But soil moisture determined whether the mine detector worked at its rated depth or at 60% of it. And when the detector couldn't find the mine, the alternative method was this: a man lying on his stomach, pushing a bayonet into the ground at a 30-degree angle, advancing it slowly until the tip contacted a hard surface, and then, with whatever steadiness his hands could manage, determining by feel whether the hard surface was a rock or a steel casing containing 5.4 kilograms of high explosive. This was the work. This was how Operation Citadel actually began. Not with an artillery barrage, not with a panzer charge, with a bayonet and a prayer. The lanes were supposed to be cleared by 0200 hours on the 5th of July. The Pioneer Battalion's war diary records that clearance was completed ohne Zwischenfall, without incident. The diary entry is matter-of-fact, almost dismissive, as if the entire operation had been routine. But when I cross-referenced this claim against the Divisional Medical Officer's casualty report for the 5th of July, the picture changed. The medical report lists 3 pioneers killed in action and 7 wounded, with timestamps beginning at 0045 hours, well before the official start of the offensive. The cause of the casualties is not specified in the medical report, but the timing and the unit designation leave only one plausible explanation: mine detonations during the clearance operation. The Pioneer Diary says, without incident. The casualty returns say 3 dead and 7 wounded. Both documents were produced by the same division, covering the same night. Someone is wrong. Or, more precisely, someone chose to define incident in a way that excluded the men who were killed, making the operation possible. When I was reconciling these two sources, the diary's clean narrative and the medical officer's messy reality, I found it striking how early in this story the pattern of institutional smoothing appears. The Pioneer Battalion presented a version of events in which everything went according to plan. The stretcher-bearers told a different story. The Bangalore torpedoes were deployed against the wire entanglements that covered the mine belts. Tangled barriers of concertina and barbed wire, designed to slow infantry and channel movement into pre-registered killing zones. Each Bangalore torpedo was detonated in place, the blast cutting a roughly 3-meter gap through the wire. The pioneers had to be within 30 meters of the detonation point to insert the charge, which meant they were inside the blast radius of their own weapon if anything went wrong. A premature detonation, a sympathetic detonation of a nearby mine, or simply a miscalculation of the standoff distance. 87 Bangalores were drawn from the supply dump that afternoon. The after-action report does not record how many were actually used. This is a common frustration in working with Pioneer records. The supply draw is documented, the expenditure is not. The gap leaves us unable to determine how many wire-cutting operations were conducted, how many gaps were blown, and how many of those gaps aligned properly with the cleared mine lanes. The tape markers, white left, red right, were supposed to connect the cleared lanes through the mines with the blown gaps through the wire into a continuous corridor. Whether they did, in the darkness, under stress, with casualties accumulating and the clock running, is a question the records don't answer with certainty. By dawn on the 5th of July, the lanes existed. Imperfectly, incompletely, but they existed. The tape markers were in place, or most of them were, depending on which account you trust, and the 4-kilometer assault frontage of the Totenkopf division was threaded with narrow corridors through which the Panzer Regiment would advance. Each corridor was approximately 8 to 10 meters wide, enough for one tank at a time, with a margin of perhaps 3 meters on either side before the uncleared mine belt began. Driving a 25-ton Panzer IV through an 8-meter-wide corridor in pre-dawn light, unable to deviate, knowing that the ground 3 meters to your left or right is sown with high explosive, is not an experience that any operational summary can convey. The tank drivers had been briefed on the lane locations and the tape color coding. Some had walked the lanes on foot the previous evening, but walking a lane and driving a lane are different experiences. On foot, you can feel the tape under your boot and correct. In a Panzer IV, buttoned up, peering through a vision slit that reduces your field of view to roughly 30 degrees, the tape is a thin colored line in the dust, if you can see it at all. The Soviet mine density across the Totenkopf's 4-kilometer front, approximately 20,400 total devices, including both anti-tank and anti-personnel types, meant that the pioneers' clearance work had, at best, created narrow channels through a field of death, not eliminated the field itself. Every mine they missed was still there, waiting. And they missed mines. The post-battle records confirm it. The Totenkopf lost its first Panzer III to a mine strike within the first kilometer of the advance, before 0600 hours on the 5th of July. The after-action report attributed the loss to a secondary belt not identified by aerial reconnaissance, which is another way of saying the intelligence was wrong, the mine was real, and a tank crew paid for the discrepancy. This is how wars are actually fought, not in the clean geometry of arrows on a map, but in the gap between what the intelligence says is there and what is actually buried in the dirt. The pioneers did their job. They did it under fire, in the dark, with bayonets. 3 of them died doing it, and the first tank to hit a mine proved that even their best wasn't enough. Clearance doesn't mean safe, it means less dangerous. The distinction is written on the hull of a Panzer III that never made it past the start line. The lanes fall silent now. The tape flutters in the wind. Somewhere behind the forward positions, the Pioneer Battalion is collecting its wounded and reorganizing for the next task. The river crossings, the bridge construction, the work that will consume the next 5 days. The 2 men who reported to the field surgeon before the crawl began are somewhere in the medical chain, their names and fates absorbed into a system that has no category for what is wrong with them. The 3 dead pioneers are wrapped in shelter halves. The 7 wounded are being treated at the battalion aid station. The war diary says, without incident. In the archive at Freiburg, these 2 versions of the same night coexist in the same filing box, separated by perhaps a dozen pages. No one has reconciled them. No one perhaps can. The night is over. The morning belongs to the tanks. Chapter 4. The First Morning. The 5th of July, 1943, 0505, Moscow time, which is 0405 in Berlin, because the German military clock and the Soviet military clock are offset by 1 hour. A fact that seems trivial until you try to reconstruct a battle from records that use both systems and rarely specify which one they mean. A Soviet regimental command post, somewhere in the defensive zone of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, facing the Totenkopf's assault frontage. The machine-typed operational log records the moment with bureaucratic precision. Artillery preparation along entire front. Density of fire exceeds anything previously observed in this sector. Forward observation posts reporting communications severed to 3rd Battalion, 151st Guards Rifle Regiment. Wire repair teams dispatched. The log entry is clean, professional, controlled. But the next line, added in pencil, a different hand, possibly a duty officer who grabbed the first writing instrument available, reads 0517. German armor identified moving in Sector 151/3. Estimated 40 tanks. That penciled addendum is the moment the 52nd Guards first saw the Totenkopf coming. I want to stay with the Soviet perspective for this chapter, and I recognize that choice requires explanation. Most accounts of the Totenkopf at Kursk are written from inside the German turret, using German sources, the divisional war diary, the Panzer Regiment situation reports, the corps-level operational orders. These sources tell you what the Germans planned, what they ordered, and, with varying degrees of reliability, what they achieved. They do not tell you what the attack looked like from the receiving end. The Soviet tactical reports contain a different kind of information. Minute-by-minute reactions, sometimes frantic, sometimes confused, that reveal where the German advance actually broke through, where it was stopped, and where the fighting was hardest. The German sources tend toward summary. The advance proceeded according to plan, while the Soviet sources tend toward granularity, specific times, specific unit identifiers, specific locations where the line buckled. To me, the most honest reconstruction of the 5th of July requires both perspectives, but the Soviet one has been systematically underutilized in English-language accounts of the southern pincer at Kursk, and I'm going to lean into it here. The German artillery preparation began at roughly 0330 Berlin time, 0430 Moscow time, with the Totenkopf's organic fire support contributing 12 Wespa 105mm self-propelled howitzers, 5 Hummel 150mm self-propelled howitzers, and detached Nebelwerfer multiple rocket launcher batteries. The Wespa is an interesting vehicle, a 105mm LE FH-18 light field howitzer mounted on a Panzer II chassis, carrying only 32 rounds of internally stowed ammunition. At a sustained fire rate of 4 rounds per minute during the initial barrage phase, each Wespa exhausted its internal ammunition supply in 8 minutes. 8 minutes. The gun could fire faster, its mechanical rate of fire was higher, but 8 minutes is what the ammunition supply allowed before the crew had to stop firing, wait for the SDKF Z-11 half-track ammunition carriers to bring forward palletized rounds, break them out of their packaging, and hand-load them into the fighting compartment. The bottleneck was never the gun, it was the truck. The resupply chain, the driver navigating forward in the dark, the loaders hauling 43-kilogram shells by hand, the stacking, the fuse setting. This was the rate-limiting reality behind the wall of fire that the 52nd Guards Rifle Division was recording in its log. The barrage sounded continuous. It wasn't. It was a series of 8-minute bursts separated by resupply pauses that the Soviet defenders, buttoned up in their trenches, couldn't distinguish from the ongoing roar of neighboring batteries. The advance itself, the moment when Totenkopf's Panzer Regiment rolled forward through the cleared lanes, hit problems almost immediately. The first recorded tank loss was a Panzer III that struck an undetected mine within the first kilometer, before 0600 hours. The after-action report attributed this to a secondary belt not identified by aerial reconnaissance. But the question of how many mine belts existed in the division's sector, 3, 4, or 5, depending on which source you believe, was already a contested issue before the first round was fired. The Corps Intelligence Annex said 3 belts. The Pioneer After-Action Report said 4. A captured Soviet engineer said 5. The Panzer III that hit the mine didn't care about the intelligence estimate. It sat immobilized in the lane, blocking the vehicles behind it, until a recovery vehicle could reach it and winch it aside. How long this took is not recorded precisely, but the Soviet operational log offers a clue. At 1340 Moscow time, the 52nd Guards noted, German tanks observed halting in Sector 151/2 for approximately 20 minutes. Cause unknown. 20 minutes. The German records explain what happened. 2 tanks from the lead platoon had thrown tracks on soft ground, possibly mine damage, possibly the simple mechanical consequence of driving off the hard-packed lane edge, and were blocking the cleared corridor. The entire advance paused while recovery vehicles worked. 20 minutes doesn't sound like much. In a war fought on timetables, where the Corps plan assumed the division would reach its first-day objectives by a specific hour, 20 minutes was a fracture in the schedule that would propagate forward through every subsequent timeline. The first infantry contact came when the Panzer Grenadiers of SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment 5, the Thule Regiment, dismounted from their half-tracks and entered the first Soviet trench line. The 52nd Guards Rifle Division had been dug in for months. Their positions were not hasty scrapes, but developed defensive works. Full-profile trenches with overhead cover, communication trenches connecting strong points, pre-sighted fields of fire, and interlocking positions that allowed units to support each other laterally. The Totenkopf's Panzer Grenadiers, some of them veterans of Demyansk, some of them 12-week replacements from the Devika training depot, advanced into these positions on foot, in the dust kicked up by their own tanks, under fire from defenders who knew every sightline and every dead space in their own trench system. What happened in those trenches is not something I'll describe in cinematic detail, because the reality of close-quarters fighting in a trench network resists narration. The war diaries reduce it to coordinates and timestamps. The medical logs reduce it to casualty categories. The letters home, if they survive at all, reduce it to silence. The things a man chose not to tell his family. What the records do show is that the advance through the first defensive belt was slower than planned and more costly than expected, a pattern that would repeat itself for the next 9 days. By midday on the 5th of July, the Totenkopf's tank status told a story the Corps plan hadn't anticipated. 1 Panzer III confirmed destroyed, 14 additional tanks damaged, a mix of mine damage, mechanical breakdowns, and combat damage from Soviet anti-tank fire. The division's armored strength had dropped from 165 to 150 in approximately 12 hours. This was not a catastrophe. A 9% reduction on the first day of a major offensive was within the bounds of expected attrition, but it established a rate of loss that, if sustained, would consume the division's armor in less than 2 weeks. And the hard fighting hadn't even begun. The first defensive belt, for all its mines and trenches, was the outermost layer of a Soviet defensive system that extended to a depth of roughly 150 kilometers in some sectors. The Totenkopf had chewed through the first few kilometers. There were a lot of kilometers left. When I compare the Soviet regimental log to the German divisional summary for the same day, the difference in texture is striking. The German summary reads like it was composed the next morning, after coffee and a night's rest. Clean, organized, presenting events in a logical sequence with clear cause and effect relationships. The advance proceeded. Resistance was encountered. Objectives were taken. The Soviet log reads like it was written in real time by a man who didn't know what was happening 200 meters from his command post. Fragments, corrections, timestamps that jump backward and forward. Penciled additions overriding typed entries. The German report is a story. The Soviet log is an experience. I trust the Soviet timestamps more. Not because Soviet record-keeping was inherently superior, it wasn't, but because a document produced in the moment of crisis, full of errors and inconsistencies, has the texture of truth in a way that a polished retrospective summary does not. The fog of war is not a metaphor. It is the difference between a clean typed paragraph and a penciled scrawl that says 40 tanks, followed by a question mark. Late in the afternoon, the Soviets counterattacked. The 52nd Guards Rifle Division's operational log records a local armored thrust, T-34s, number unspecified, against the Totenkopf's right flank. The attack was repulsed, apparently without major German losses, but its significance lay not in its outcome, but in its timing and composition. The German intelligence assessment for the Totenkopf sector had placed Soviet tactical armor reserves farther from the front than this counterattack implied. The T-34s came from somewhere closer, which meant the Soviet defensive layout was denser than the Corps intelligence section had estimated. This was not a catastrophic intelligence failure. The counterattack was small and unsuccessful, but it was an indicator. The Soviets had more armor closer to the front than expected. If that was true at the first defensive belt, what was waiting at the second? And the third? And behind the Psel River, where the real Soviet reserves were massing. The first day's fighting didn't just cost the Totenkopf 15 tanks. It cost the Germans the assumption that their intelligence picture was accurate. And that second loss would prove more expensive than the first. The Totenkopf's artillery had fired approximately 14,200 rounds in the first 24 hours of Citadel, a figure drawn from the divisional quartermaster's resupply requests, which logged outgoing ammunition by type and quantity. 14,200 rounds exceeded the planned allocation by roughly 18%. Every excess round fired on day 1 was a round unavailable on day 8. The quartermaster's calculation was simple. At this consumption rate, the division would exhaust its organic ammunition reserves before the offensive reached its objectives, unless resupply convoys maintained an uninterrupted flow from the Corps ammunition dump. The convoys used the same roads as the tank columns, the supply trucks, the fuel tankers, the medical evacuation vehicles, and every other element of the logistical tail that a mechanized division drags behind it. One broken-down truck blocking a single-lane road could delay an ammunition resupply by hours. These are not dramatic facts, they are logistical facts. And logistical facts are the ones that actually determine whether an offensive succeeds or fails long before the tanks reach the enemy's final defensive line. The 5th of July ended with the Totenkopf having advanced several kilometers into the first Soviet defensive belt at a cost of 15 tanks and an unknowable number of personnel casualties. Unknowable because the daily personnel returns for the 5th are less complete than the tank status reports, a common asymmetry in German record-keeping that privileges hardware over people. The division was behind schedule. Not dramatically, hours, not days, but behind. The Corps plan required the Totenkopf to protect the right flank of the II SS Panzer Corps, while the Leibstandarte and Das Reich drove the main effort forward, and this flank protection role would dominate the division's next 4 days, consuming combat power in defensive fighting that produced no territorial gain and attracted no historical attention. The popular narratives of Kursk's southern pincer focus on the Leibstandarte's dramatic thrust toward Prokhorovka. The Totenkopf's story for the next 96 hours is something quieter, grimmer, and less narratable, holding the door open while someone else walks through it. That story begins tomorrow, and the division that fights it has already lost 9% of its armor and 18% more ammunition than planned. The numbers don't lie. They just accumulate, silently, in columns that no one reads until it's too late. Chapter 5. The Right Flank Problem. The 7th of July, 1943, 2000 hours, somewhere in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters. Likely a dugout or a requisitioned building behind the forward units, though the exact location shifts as the Corps advances. A staff officer is reviewing the daily Lagekarte, the situation map. The map is a large format sheet overlaid with acetate, on which unit positions have been marked in grease pencil using standard military symbology. The Leibstandarte's symbol, a skeleton key, has pushed deep into the 2nd Soviet defensive belt, advancing northeast. Das Reich occupies an intermediate position, and the Totenkopf, represented by the skull, the death's head that gave the division its name, sits in a shallow concave arc, roughly 8 kilometers east of the Leibstandarte's forward elements, barely moved in 48 hours. The staff officer writes 2 words in grease pencil in the margin of the map sheet. T. Gebunden. Totenkopf, tied down. Those 2 words explain the division's entire first 4 days better than any post-war memoir. The problem was the right flank. When the 2nd SS Panzer Corps launched its assault on the 5th of July, the operational design called for the Leibstandarte to drive the main effort, the pointed end of the spear, advancing directly toward Prokhorovka. Das Reich would echelon to its right, supporting and protecting, and the Totenkopf would hold the Corps' rightmost flank, the eastern edge of the advance, where the corridor between the SS advance and the neighboring 3rd Panzer Corps was most vulnerable to Soviet counterattack. In theory, this was a temporary arrangement. The Totenkopf would hold the flank until the Corps' forward momentum outpaced the Soviet ability to threaten it, and then the division would be released for its own offensive role. In practice, the flank never stopped being threatened. The Soviet 2nd Tank Corps and elements of the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, positioned in the triangle of territory between the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and the 3rd Panzer Corps, the area the German records call the Donetsk Triangle, launched probing attacks against the Totenkopf's exposed eastern flank, beginning on the 6th of July and continuing with increasing intensity through the 8th. Every probe required a response. Every response consumed ammunition, fuel, and mechanical endurance. And every hour the Totenkopf spent parrying flanking thrusts was an hour it was not advancing. Hermann Priess, the divisional commander, understood what was happening to his formation. The fragmentary radio traffic between the Totenkopf and the Corps headquarters suggests. I say suggests because the surviving intercepts are incomplete, with a notable gap between 1400 and 1600 hours on the 7th of July, that Priess repeatedly requested release from the flank protection mission. He wanted to concentrate his division and advance. The flank duty was bleeding him dry. In his post-war interrogation, part of the ETHINT series, the U.S. Army's program of debriefing captured German officers. Priess claimed he had repeatedly communicated to Hauser that the flank role was consuming his division's combat power. Hauser's own post-war account makes no mention of these requests. The 2-hour gap in the Corps radio log for the 7th of July, the hours during which Priess's most urgent appeals may have been transmitted, is maddening. Whether the gap is accidental, equipment failure, a destroyed logbook, a clerk's oversight, or deliberate, is unknowable at this distance. But the gap aligns suspiciously well with the precise period when the argument between a divisional commander fighting for his formation's release and a corps commander focused on the main effort would have been most intense. The toll on the division's equipment was relentless. On the 6th of July, tank strength dropped from 150 to 139. 3 tanks destroyed outright, 8 damaged. On the 7th, down to 133, 1 destroyed, 7 damaged, 2 returned from repair. On the 8th, down to 122, 2 destroyed, 9 damaged, 0 returned from repair. That last figure, 0 returned to duty on the 8th of July, is one of the most operationally significant data points in the Totenkopf's Kursk records, and it is easy to overlook in the larger cascade of numbers. 0 returns from repair means the repair battalion produced nothing that day. Why? Because on the 8th, the division received orders to move north. The repair battalion was not repairing. It was packing up, loading tools onto trucks, displacing forward to a new position. When a division moves, its mechanics drive instead of weld. The invisible cost of the order to advance was a full 24-hour period in which every damaged tank sat where it had been towed, untouched, rusting under the Steppe sun, while the workshop that could have fixed it rolled past on a flatbed. The ammunition expenditure during this flank-holding period tells its own story. Between the 5th and the 8th of July, 4 days of what the secondary literature politely calls flank protection, the Totenkopf expended approximately 38,400 rounds of small arms ammunition, 6,200 mortar rounds, and 2,100 anti-tank rounds. I compiled these figures from the divisional quartermaster's resupply requests, which are the best available proxy for ammunition consumption when daily expenditure reports are incomplete. These numbers represent material consumed without meaningful territorial gain. The Totenkopf fired 2,100 anti-tank rounds and advanced essentially nowhere. Every round expended in defensive fighting was a round that would not be available for the Psel crossing. Every mortar bomb that landed on a Soviet probing attack was a mortar bomb that couldn't support the assault on Hill 226.6. The concept of opportunity cost was not formalized in 1943 German military doctrine. It would become a standard feature of modern joint force allocation thinking decades later. But the Totenkopf's experience between the 5th and 8th of July is its clearest possible illustration.
When I was mapping the division's daily positions against the Corps-level advance, the visual contrast was stark. I took the Lagakart overlays for the 6th, 7th, and 8th, or rather, the published reproductions available in the secondary literature, since the originals remain in archival holdings, and traced the Leibstandarte forward symbol as it pushed northeast, day by day, toward Prokhorovka. Then I traced the Totenkopf symbol. It barely moves. A few kilometers of lateral adjustment, a slight repositioning as one flank sector becomes more threatened than another, but no forward progress of operational significance. The Totenkopf was running in place, burning fuel, burning ammunition, burning the mechanical life out of its tanks, and going nowhere. The two words on the map, T, gebunden, contained this entire reality. Tied down, fixed, consumed by someone else's problem. It fascinates me that no English-language popular history of Kursk, to my knowledge, has devoted significant attention to this phase. The narrative jumps from the opening assault on the 5th Strait to the Psel crossing on the 10th, as if the Totenkopf teleported from one to the other. It didn't. It spent 4 days being bled in a role that nobody writes about because it wasn't dramatic enough. The Martyr IIs suffered disproportionately during the flank-holding period, and their experience illustrates a problem that the equipment tables didn't anticipate. In an advancing offensive, the Martyr II's limitations, the open-topped fighting compartment, the restricted gun traverse, the thin armor, were partially mitigated by mobility. The vehicle could shoot and move, engaging targets, and then displacing before return fire arrived. In a static defensive role, the Martyr II was forced to occupy hull-down positions for extended periods, presenting a fixed target that Soviet mortar and artillery observers could register and engage with indirect fire. The open top meant that blast and fragmentation from a mortar round landing within 20 meters could wound or kill the crew without penetrating any armor at all. The Totenkopf's martyr crews, trapped in a defensive mission that negated their vehicle's one tactical advantage, mobility, developed an improvised response. They scavenged sheet metal from destroyed Soviet vehicles and fashioned crude overhead shields, bolting or welding them to the gun shield's upper rim to provide at least some protection from airburst fragments. This modification is documented in a single photograph from the divisional photographer's collection, showing a Martyr II with a distinctly non-standard metal awning over the fighting compartment. It looks like a tin roof on a shed. It was a tin roof on a coffin, and the men underneath it knew the difference. By the evening of the 8th of July, the order finally came. The Totenkopf was released from its flank protection role and directed to advance north toward the Psel River. Hauser needed the division to cross the river and establish a bridgehead on the northern bank, securing the right flank of the Corps' advance from a position of strength rather than through the grinding defensive fighting of the previous 4 days. The order was, in one sense, what Priess had been asking for. In another sense, it was 4 days too late. The division that received the order on the 8th was not the division that had stood on the start line on the 5th. It had lost 43 tanks from its starting strength of 165, 26% of its armor consumed in defensive fighting. Its ammunition reserves were depleted below planned levels. Its repair battalion had lost a full day of productivity to the displacement, and it was now being asked to cross a major river obstacle and establish a bridgehead against a defended position. The contrast between the mission and the means is the kind of gap that operational planning is supposed to prevent and that combat invariably creates. The 4 days of flank duty had one additional consequence that shows up nowhere in the operational reports, but is visible in the tank status returns if you know where to look. The cumulative mechanical stress on the division's power plants, the engines, transmissions, suspensions, and running gear of vehicles that had been operating continuously since the 5th, driving short distances, pivoting to face threats, revving engines in and out of hull-down positions, was eroding the fleet from within. A Panzer IV's Maybach HL-120 engine was rated for a certain number of operating hours before major overhaul. The ZFS SG-76 six-speed transmission had specific service intervals. The track pins wore at rates proportional to the number of pivots.
None of this appears as a loss in the daily reports. The tank is still listed as operational, but its remaining mechanical life has been shortened. The tank that drives to the Psel River on the 9th of July is older, in engineering terms, than its calendar age suggests. It has been aged by 4 days of defensive duty that achieved nothing except keeping a flank quiet. And that aging will manifest as breakdowns, thrown tracks, overheating engines, and stuck transmissions in exactly the moments when the division needs every vehicle running. At the river, on the bridge, in the bridgehead. The opportunity cost of flank protection was not just the ammunition expended or the time lost. It was the mechanical life consumed, invisibly, from vehicles that could not afford to lose a single operating hour. The Totenkopf begins its move north on the night of the 8th of July. The repair battalion is still in transit. The ammunition stocks are being topped off from Corps-level reserves, an emergency resupply that shouldn't have been necessary if the consumption rates had matched the plan. The tank status report shows 122 armored fighting vehicles, down from 165, 43 gone. Some destroyed, most damaged, some broken down, some being repaired somewhere behind the lines by mechanics who can't work because their workshop is on the back of a truck driving to a new location. The grease pencil annotation on the map, T. Gebunden, has been wiped off, replaced by a new symbol showing the division's axis of advance toward the river. The word Gebunden is gone from the acetate, but its consequences are not. They ride with the division in every worn gear tooth, every depleted ammunition rack, every engine that's running 100 hours closer to failure than it should be. The flank duty is over. Its price is just beginning to come due. Chapter 6. The Bridge. The 10th of July, 1943, pre-dawn. The south bank of the river Psel, near the hamlet of Vasilevka, approximately 50 kilometers northeast of Belgorod. The river at this point is roughly 30 meters wide, not a great river, not a dramatic gorge, just a middleweight Ukrainian waterway with soft banks, a moderate current, and a northern escarpment that rises steeply from the water's edge to a plateau above. In the half-light, the pioneers of SS Pioneer Battalion 3 are unloading equipment from trucks, 34 standard Brückengerät B pontoon sections, welded steel floats, each 6.55 meters long, with a buoyancy rating of approximately 8 metric tons. 2,400 running meters of heavy timber, 480 steel cable connectors. These are the components of a 60-ton rated military bridge. The timber specification is recorded in a margin note on the construction report. Kiefer, grün. Pine, green. Unseasoned. The pioneers are building a bridge rated to carry a 57-ton Tiger tank from green lumber. Seasoned timber can bear roughly 30% more load than green stock. They didn't have seasoned timber. They had what the supply dump could provide. And what the supply dump provided was fresh-cut pine that still had sap running through its grain. The crossing site had been selected the previous day, the 9th of July, after a pioneer patrol evaluated 3 potential locations along the Totenkopf sector of the Psel. The patrol report, a terse document, functionally a checklist, rejected the first site due to soft banks that could not support the weight of armored vehicles on the approach roads. Tanks don't float, but they also don't drive through mud without sinking. A Panzer IV would bury itself to the hull on a soft riverbank, blocking the approach lane for every vehicle behind it. The second site was rejected because a Soviet observation post on the northern bank had a direct line of sight to the crossing point, meaning the bridge construction would be conducted under observed artillery fire from the moment the first pontoon hit the water. The third site, near Vasilevka, was selected despite a narrow approach road, because the southern bank was firm enough to support vehicle traffic, and the northern bank's observation geometry was partially masked by a bend in the river. Partially is the operative word. The bridge would still be visible to Soviet observers, but it would be less visible than at Site 2. In combat engineering, less bad is often the best available option. The construction began in darkness. The Brückengerät B system was a standard Wehrmacht military bridging set, designed for rapid assembly by trained engineer units. Each pontoon section was floated into the river, anchored against the current with cables secured to stakes driven into the banks, and connected to its neighbors with steel crossbeams. Heavy timber decking was laid transversely across the pontoons, forming the roadway surface. The bridge's rated capacity, 60 tons, was determined by the spacing of the pontoons, approximately 2-meter intervals for a 60-ton load, the strength of the crossbeams, and the bending capacity of the timber decking under concentrated load. And here the green pine problem becomes an engineering problem with life-or-death implications. The modulus of rupture, the measure of a material's resistance to bending failure, for seasoned Scots pine, is approximately 55 megapascals. For unseasoned stock of the same species, it drops to roughly 40 megapascals. The pioneers were working with material that was approximately 73% as strong as what the bridge design assumed. A 60-ton rated bridge built from material at 73% of design strength is not a 60-ton bridge. It is a bridge that will probably hold 60 tons. Probably. The word probably doesn't appear in engineering specifications for a reason. The critical calculation, the one that no one wrote down but every pioneer understood intuitively, was the bending moment at mid-span under a concentrated 57-ton load. A Tiger I, at 57 tons combat loaded, placed its weight on 2 tracks, each approximately 3.7 meters long, distributing the load across roughly 7.4 meters of bridge deck. But the maximum bending stress occurs not at the load center, but at the midpoint between supporting pontoons. The unsupported span where the timber decking has to carry the weight without the direct buoyancy support of a float beneath it. At 2-meter pontoon intervals, the unsupported span was approximately 1.5 meters, the distance between the edge of one pontoon and the edge of the next. Across that 1.5 meters of green pine, 57 tons of Tiger would pass. The margin between holds and fails was approximately 3 tons, 5%. In civilian structural engineering, a 5% margin above rated load would be considered unacceptable for a permanent structure. For a temporary military bridge under fire, built from substandard materials in darkness by men who hadn't slept, it was what they had. The construction proceeded under increasing harassment. Soviet artillery, the surviving batteries of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, and, increasingly, the guns of the freshly arriving 95th Guards Rifle Division, began searching for the crossing point once daylight revealed the activity on the south bank. The construction report records casualties among the pioneer workforce, but without the specificity I'd prefer. Losses during the building phase, without a breakdown between killed and wounded. Mark Healy, in his study of the Kursk offensive, cites a figure of 430 total casualties suffered by the Totenkopf in securing the crossing, a number that encompasses the pioneer losses during construction, the infantry fighting to secure the far bank, and the initial combat on the northern plateau. 430 men, spread across multiple subunits over roughly 48 hours, to get a bridge across 30 meters of river. 14 casualties per meter of river crossed. It's an absurd calculation, but absurd calculations sometimes illuminate the disproportionate cost of small obstacles. The Psel was not the Rhine. It was not the Volga. It was a modest river that a strong swimmer could cross in a few minutes, and it cost the Totenkopf 430 men. When I was researching the bridge construction timeline, I encountered a discrepancy that matters more than it might seem. Healy states that the bridge was completed by midday on the 10th. The Pioneer Battalion diary records the bridge as trafficable for heavy vehicles at 14:30 hours, 2.5 hours later. A modern battlefield survey of the crossing site, conducted by the Walking the Battlefields group in 2016 with the guidance of Russian historian Valery Zamulin, noted that the terrain at the crossing point suggests construction would have been more complex than some accounts indicate. The steep northern bank required additional engineering work to create a viable exit ramp for heavy vehicles. I don't know which timeline is correct. Healy may have been working from a corps-level summary that reported the bridge complete at an earlier hour. The Pioneer diary may reflect the point at which heavy vehicles, Tigers specifically, were authorized to cross, which could have been later than the moment the bridge was technically complete. The difference between bridge complete and bridge cleared for Tigers is the difference between a structure that can hold 60 tons and a structure that an officer is willing to bet a 57-ton irreplaceable vehicle on. That decision, to send the first Tiger across, was made by someone whose name I cannot confirm from the surviving records, but whose hands must have been sweating. The first Tigers crossed on the afternoon of the 10th of July. 10 vehicles, or 9, depending on which strength report you accept, rolled onto the bridge one at a time. The bridge was wide enough for one vehicle only. Each Tiger paused at the approach, its driver aligning the tracks with the timber deck, and then crept forward at walking speed. The 57 tons transferred from the bank to the bridge in a sequence of increasing stress. First the front road wheels, then the midpoint where the hull's center of gravity passed over the unsupported span, then the rear drive sprockets. The moment of maximum stress. The instant when the Tiger's center of gravity was directly above the longest unsupported timber span, lasted perhaps 2 or 3 seconds per vehicle. In those seconds, the green pine was loaded to within 5% of its predicted failure point. The wood flexed. It deflected downward under the load. Seasoned timber deflects less, and then recovered as the vehicle passed. This happened 10 times, or 9 times. Each crossing was a structural experiment conducted without a safety net. If the bridge had failed at midspan, the Tiger would have dropped approximately 2 meters into the cell, turret deep in water, probably irrecoverable. The crew might have survived, the tank would not have, and the bridge would have been gone, stranding every vehicle that hadn't yet crossed on the wrong side of the river. By the end of the 11th of July, approximately 120 tanks and assault guns had crossed the Psel on the Pioneer-built bridge. 120 armored fighting vehicles, ranging from 10.8-ton Marder IIs to 57-ton Tigers, all funneled through a single crossing point on a single bridge built from green pine. The bridge was the Totenkopf's single point of failure for the entire Psel operation. One Soviet artillery shell, not a barrage, not a bombing run, a single well-aimed round from a 122mm howitzer, impacting the bridge deck, would have severed the division's armor from its supply line, its repair infrastructure, its evacuation capability, and its route of retreat. One round. The Soviets tried. The artillery harassment was continuous, but the bridge held. It held because the pioneers had over-engineered the cable anchorage. It held because the pontoon spacing was tight enough that the unsupported spans were short. It held because green pine, despite its reduced bending strength, is not paper. It flexes before it breaks, and the bridge was designed with enough flexibility to absorb near-miss concussions without fracturing the deck. And it held because sometimes, in war, the mathematics of probability simply fall in your favor. Not because of skill or planning or courage, though all three were present. Because chance, which is the final arbiter of every military operation, happened to point the other way that day. The pioneers themselves, the men who built this bridge, who anchored the pontoons, who laid the timber, who worked through artillery fire in waist-deep water, occupy a strange place in the Totenkopf story. They are absent from the tank-centric narratives that dominate Kursk literature. They held no glamour in the popular imagination. They drove no Tigers. They scored no kills. They built a bridge. And then the tanks drove over it. The 430 casualties the division suffered securing the crossing included pioneer personnel killed and wounded during the construction, men hit by shell fragments while bolting crossbeams, men who drowned when a near-miss concussion knocked them off a pontoon, men whose names appear on casualty lists but nowhere in the histories that celebrate the armored victories their work made possible. I don't know their names. The Pioneer Battalion's casualty records for this specific action, if they survive at all, are not among the documents I was able to locate. What I know is that without them, the Totenkopf's Panzer Regiment, every Tiger, every Panzer IV, every Stug III, would have sat on the south bank of the Psel and watched the battle from the wrong side of a 30-meter-wide river. The bridge was the battle. Everything else was what the bridge made possible. The bridge stands now in the late afternoon light of the 11th of July, sagging slightly under the cumulative stress of 120 crossings, the green pine darkened with diesel fuel and river water, the cable anchorages creaking. North of the river, on the plateau above the steep bank, the Totenkopf's armor is fanning out into a bridgehead approximately 4 kilometers wide. The ground is flat, open steppe, good tank country if you're advancing, and a killing field if you're caught in the open by an enemy with more tanks than you. South of the river, the supply echelon is queuing for its turn to cross. Ammunition trucks, fuel bowsers, medical vehicles, the repair battalion's workshop trucks with their welding equipment and spare parts. The bridge can handle one vehicle at a time. The queue stretches back down the approach road. Somewhere in that queue is the fuel that the Tigers need, the ammunition that the Panzer Grenadiers will burn through in the next 48 hours, and the medical evacuation capability that will carry the wounded back across the river when the fighting peaks. All of it funneled through 30 meters of green pine and welded steel. The bridgehead is established. The tanks are across. And the bridge, the 60-ton bridge built by men whose names the histories forgot, from timber that shouldn't have been strong enough, under fire that should have destroyed it, is still there, waiting for the morning and everything the morning will bring. Chapter 7. The Man in the Turret. The 3rd of July, 1943, 2 days before the offensive. Somewhere in the Totenkopf's assembly area, a Panzer IV sits idling in a dispersal position among scattered trees, its Maybach HL-120 engine turning over at low RPM. The tank hasn't been shut down in 3 days. None of them have. The engines are kept running to maintain battery charge and ensure instant readiness for a movement order that could come at any moment. 3 days of continuous engine vibration translates, inside the hull, to a kind of permanent seasickness, a low-frequency tremor that travels through the steel floor plates, up through the seat frames, and into the bones of every man aboard. A letter written that day, recovered after the war from a paybook found inside a destroyed Panzer IV near Hill 226.6, contains the sentence, Mutti, wir haben seit 3 Tagen die Motoren nicht abgestellt. Mother, we haven't shut down the engines for 3 days. The handwriting starts neat, schoolboy cursive, careful and practiced, and deteriorates toward the bottom of the page. By the final line, the letters are shaking. 3 days of engine vibration will do that to a man's hands. I want to pause the machinery of this documentary for 1 chapter. For 6 chapters, I've given you tonnages, ammunition counts, bridge tolerances, and mine densities. Every number I've cited had a heartbeat behind it. Every tank on the equipment return had 5 men inside. A commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator, crammed into a space smaller than a modern bathroom. The interior of a Panzer IV Ausführung G is not a room. It is a steel box roughly 3 meters long, 1.7 meters wide at the turret basket, and 1.5 meters from floor plate to turret roof. Into this space are packed the main gun's breech mechanism, 87 rounds of 75mm ammunition in various stowage racks, the radio set, the turret traverse mechanism, the driver's controls, the transmission housing, and 5 human beings wearing wool uniforms in July steppe heat. The external air temperature on the 10th of July was approximately 30 degrees Celsius. Inside a buttoned-up tank, hatches closed against shell fragments and sniper fire. The internal temperature could exceed 50 degrees. The noise level when the main gun fired was roughly 120 decibels, equivalent to standing 30 meters from a jet engine. There were no hearing protectors. There was no air conditioning. There was the steel box and the men inside it. This chapter has no technical deep dive. That absence is deliberate. After 6 chapters of mechanisms and statistics, the silence of technical detail is meant to create a different kind of space, one in which a single human voice can be heard. The man who wrote the letter home was an SS Unterscharführer, a junior NCO, commanding a Panzer IV in the regiment's 2nd Battalion. I won't invent his name because the letter survives only as a fragment in a private collection, cited in a secondary source, and I cannot confirm the original. What I can confirm is the paybook. These small identification documents, carried in every soldier's breast pocket, routinely survived when the men carrying them did not. The paybook's owner appears on the divisional casualty list for the 12th of July. The notation beside his name is a single word: gefallen, fallen. Between the letter of the 3rd and the casualty list of the 12th, 9 days elapsed. In those 9 days, he drove his tank through cleared mine lanes, fired his gun at targets he may or may not have seen clearly through the dust, crossed a bridge made of green pine, and died on a hill with a number instead of a name. The crew of a Panzer IV functioned as a social unit of extraordinary intimacy and absolute dependency. 5 men who ate together, slept in or beside their vehicle together, relieved themselves within meters of each other, and fought in a space where each man's survival depended on the others performing their specific function within seconds. The driver, seated in the left front hull, could see the battlefield only through a narrow vision slit, roughly 30 degrees of forward arc. He drove essentially blind to everything outside that arc, relying on the commander's voice through the intercom to direct course changes. The radio operator, beside the driver in the right front hull, manned the bow machine gun and the Fu-5 radio set. The loader, standing in the turret basket, fed 75mm rounds into the breech, each round weighing approximately 6.8 kilograms, at a rate dictated by the gunner's fire commands. In sustained action, the loader might handle 30 to 40 rounds in a 10-minute engagement, lifting and slamming nearly 300 kilograms of ammunition. The gunner traversed and elevated the main gun using hand wheels and fired on the commander's order. And the commander, standing in the turret with his head in the cupola, was the crew's only set of eyes, the only man with a 360-degree view of the battlefield. The moment of contact, the instant when a Soviet anti-tank round arrives, is not something a tank crew sees. This is a misconception born from film. A 76mm round, traveling at 650 meters per second, crosses the distance from a firing position at 800 meters in slightly over 1 second. The human eye cannot track it. What the crew experiences is the impact, a sound that survivors describe not as an explosion, but as an enormous metallic clang, like someone striking the hull with a building-sized hammer. If you hear the clang, you are alive. If you are alive, you have approximately 1/3 of a second to assess: penetration or ricochet. If the round penetrated, you know because of the spall. Fragments of the inner armor wall blasted into the fighting compartment at velocities sufficient to kill. If it ricocheted, you know because you are still thinking. The distinction between these two outcomes, life and death, is contained in a fraction of a second of attention and a few millimeters of steel. This was the operational reality behind every line of every tank status report I've cited. Every tank listed as damaged endured at least one of these moments. Every tank listed as destroyed endured the last one. To me, the most telling detail in this letter isn't what the man wrote, it's what the censorship system did with it. All outgoing Feldpost was required to pass through an officer censor before dispatch. This letter contained operationally sensitive information. The detail about running engines for 3 days implied imminent offensive operations. A competent censor should have struck the line or returned the letter. It passed through. Either the censoring officer was negligent, possible given the volume of mail processed in a division of 15,000 men, or he read the letter, recognized it for what it was, a frightened young man writing to his mother, and decided that a scared boy's words were not an intelligence risk. I prefer the second interpretation. I cannot prove it, but the letter's survival, uncensored, suggests that somewhere in the Totenkopf's chain of command, an officer made a small, quiet decision to let a human moment pass through the machinery of war unredacted. A Panzer IV crew consumed approximately 12 liters of drinking water per day in summer steppe conditions, a physiological requirement, not a preference, in temperatures exceeding 30 degrees Celsius. The standard canteen allocation was 4 liters per man, which meant 20 liters per 5-man crew. The deficit, The gap between what the body required and what the supply system provided was made up from whatever source was available. River water scooped into canteens during halts. Rainwater collected in helmets. Water from wells in captured Soviet positions, often of uncertain quality. Dehydration degrades cognitive function before it degrades physical function. A man at 5% dehydration makes worse decisions before he feels weaker. No operational study of the Kursk battle has ever attempted to quantify the effect of chronic low-grade dehydration on crew performance. The data doesn't exist. But the conditions that would produce it, July heat, steel enclosures, inadequate water supply, continuous physical exertion, were universal across every tank crew on both sides. The battle was fought by thirsty men. The modern study of blast-related traumatic brain injury in armored vehicle crews, a field that has received significant attention from military medical researchers since the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, traces its clinical origins to precisely the conditions these men experienced. The continuous vibration from a running engine, the repeated concussive force of main gun firing, 120 decibels, dozens of times per engagement, with no hearing protection and no shock absorption for the skull. The chronic sleep deprivation, 20-minute naps taken sitting upright on an ammunition rack, interrupted by alerts, engine noise, and the physiological stress of combat anticipation. None of this was recognized as injurious in 1943. No German medical officer was screening tank crews for traumatic brain injury. No Soviet doctor was evaluating cumulative blast exposure. The damage accumulated silently, inside skulls that the helmets were not designed to protect from the enemy within, the crew's own weapon. The letter writer is dead by the 12th of July. His tank is one of 57 that the Totenkopf lost in 48 hours. The paybook that contained his letter was recovered. By whom, under what circumstances, the record does not say, and eventually entered a private collection. The letter fragment surfaced decades later. His name, if it was ever attached to the fragment, has been separated from it by the passage of time and the indifference of filing systems. What remains is a single sentence about running engines and a mother's name, Mutti, written in handwriting that shook. He was not a general, he was not a strategist, he was not a war criminal as far as any surviving record indicates, though he served in a formation whose institutional origins were criminal by any definition. He was a man in a steel box who wrote a letter home because he was frightened, and who died 9 days later on a hill above a river that most people have never heard of. I cannot build a narrative around him because I don't have enough material. I can only note that he existed and that the numbers in this documentary, the tonnages, the percentages, the bridge tolerances, were experienced by him not as data, but as fear, heat, thirst, noise, and the vibration that wouldn't stop. The engine idles on. Somewhere in the assembly area, other tanks are running too. A low diesel murmur spread across kilometers of dispersal positions. Hundreds of Maybach engines turning over in the dark, burning fuel to maintain battery charge for a battle that hasn't started yet. The letter has been folded, placed in the paybook, tucked into a breast pocket. The hands that wrote it are steadier now, or perhaps not. In 2 days, the bombardment begins. In 5 days, the bridge. In 9 days, the hill. The man in the turret doesn't know any of this. He knows the engine is running. He knows his mother's address. He knows the hatch is closed and the steel is close. That is all anyone inside a tank ever knows. Chapter 8, The Plateau. The 11th of July, 1943. The plateau north of the river Psel. Flat, open steppes stretching to the northeast. Wheat fields and grass, largely featureless to the untrained eye, but scored with shallow folds in the terrain that a veteran tanker could use for hold-down positions, and a Soviet defensive planner could use for concealed anti-tank guns. The Totenkopf's armor has been crossing the bridge for roughly 36 hours. Approximately 120 tanks and assault guns are now on the north bank, fanning out from the crossing point into a bridgehead roughly 4 kilometers wide. And into this bridgehead, from the north, fresh Soviet forces are arriving. They are not the depleted remnants of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, which has been fighting the Totenkopf since the 5th of July. They are the 95th Guards Rifle Division, full strength, unbloodied, and deployed directly into the path of the Totenkopf's advance by General Zadov, commanding the 5th Guards Army. The 95th Guards March Order, dated the 10th of July, survives in Russian archival holdings. It contains a detail that captures the uncertainty of the entire situation better than any operational summary. On the route overlay, the map trace showing the division's intended line of march, someone penciled a question mark beside the road junction at Kardashevka. The operations officer who drew the march route did not know whether this junction was still in Soviet hands when he committed his division to march through it. He drew the route anyway. 12 hours later, the 95th Guards lead elements collided with Totenkopf pioneers dug in along that very road. The question mark had been answered by contact, not by intelligence. This is what operational uncertainty looks like in the archive. Not a dramatic revelation, but a penciled symbol on a map that says, "I don't know," in the language of military graphics. The Totenkopf's tank status report for the 11th of July shows something that, in the context of the previous 6 days, qualifies as extraordinary. Tank strength, 134. That's 12 more than the 122 of the 8th, the day the division left its flank-holding position. 21 tanks returned to duty in 24 hours. The repair battalion, having finally set up its workshops at a fixed location near the crossing site, had worked through the night of the 10th-11th. The repaired vehicles were a mix of mine-damaged Panzer IIIs, mechanically broken-down Panzer IVs, and at least one Tiger that had been sidelined with an engine overheating problem. 134 operational tanks was the division's highest figure since the 6th of July. The repair battalion's performance on this single day, 21 returns in 24 hours, represented a repair rate that no Soviet armored formation at Kursk could match. When I was comparing these numbers against the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps' repair record for the same period, data preserved in the Dupuy Institute's Kursk database, the asymmetry was stark. The Totenkopf repaired approximately 57% of its damaged vehicles during the battle. The Soviet Corps managed roughly 25%. A 2-to-1 German advantage in repair efficiency. This was not about heroism or ideology. It was about welding torches, spare part stockpiles, and a maintenance doctrine that prioritized getting damaged vehicles back into the fight. The tactical situation on the 11th was shaped by 2 simultaneous developments. First, the Totenkopf's armor drove northeast from its positions around the village of Kliuchi, secured on the morning of the 11th, toward the dominant terrain feature of Hill 226.6. This hill was unremarkable in absolute terms, a gentle rise on the plateau, the kind of feature that would not merit a second glance on a peacetime drive through the countryside. In military terms, it commanded the surrounding terrain and offered observation over several kilometers in every direction. Whoever held it could direct artillery fire across the bridgehead. The Totenkopf needed it. The Soviets knew they needed it. The fight for Hill 226.6 would consume the next 48 hours. Second, unknown to Priest and his staff, the Soviet High Command had set in motion the counterattack that would define the 12th of July. Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army was moving into its assembly areas. The Totenkopf's 4-kilometer bridgehead, held by a division at 134 tanks, was about to receive the attention of an entire Soviet tank army. The 95th Guards Rifle Division's arrival changed the character of the fighting on the plateau. The 52nd Guards, which had faced the Totenkopf since day 1, was depleted, its battalions reduced to fragments, its combat power a fraction of its establishment strength. It fought hard because Guards divisions fought hard, but it fought with the ragged intensity of a formation that had been hit repeatedly and was running on institutional stubbornness rather than material strength. The 95th Guards was different. It was at full strength. Its battalions were intact. Its ammunition supply was fresh. Its soldiers had not yet experienced the specific terror of facing SS Panzer formations in open terrain. Zadov deployed it into the bridgehead zone specifically because it was uncontaminated by the demoralization of the first week's fighting. A reserve committed precisely because it had not yet been committed. Within 24 hours of its arrival, it would suffer casualties severe enough to render multiple battalions combat ineffective.
Fresh troops meeting experienced armored formations in a compressed space produced an intensity of fighting that neither side's headquarters had predicted. The source conflict for this phase centers on timing. Soviet records claim the 95th Guards was in position, meaning deployed in its defensive sectors, with units dug in and ready, by midday on the 11th. German records show the Totenkopf encountering fresh, unidentified infantry on the afternoon of the 11th. If the Soviet claim is correct, the Totenkopf attacked a prepared defense and still advanced. If the German observation is correct, that the infantry was still arriving when contact occurred, then the engagement was a meeting battle, not an assault against a set defense. The distinction matters for understanding casualty patterns, tactical success, and the relative performance of both formations. A meeting engagement favors the side with better combined arms coordination. An attack against a prepared defense favors the defender. Without a minute-by-minute reconciliation of both sides' records, which would require access to Russian archival holdings that have been intermittently restricted since 2014, the question remains open. It fascinates me that the Totenkopf's repair rate, 57% of damaged tanks returned to service, compared to 25% for the Soviet 2nd Guards Tank Corps, has received so little attention in the popular literature. Repair isn't dramatic. There is no cinematic version of a mechanic replacing a transmission final drive under a tarpaulin at 2 in the morning. But the repair battalion's output on the 11th of July, 21 tanks returned to duty, giving the division its highest operational strength in 5 days, was arguably more important than any tactical victory the Panzer Regiment achieved that day. A division that can repair faster than it loses is a division that can sustain combat operations indefinitely, at least in theory. A division that cannot repair faster than it loses is a division on a clock. The Totenkopf, on the 11th of July, was winning the repair race. Tomorrow, it would lose it. The night of the 11th, 12th of July, the Totenkopf holds a bridgehead 4 kilometers wide on the north bank of the Psel. Its armor is concentrated around Hill 226.6 and the village of Kliuchi. 134 tanks are operational. The Panzer Grenadier Regiments, Tula and Theodor Eicke, are dug in along the bridgehead perimeter. The Pioneer Bridge is still standing, still the only crossing point for heavy vehicles, still a single point of failure bottleneck that Soviet artillery searches for every hour. South of the Psel, the supply echelon is staging forward. The repair battalion has cleared its backlog and is preparing for whatever tomorrow brings. There is a quality of organized readiness in the division's dispositions that the records convey through the simple fact of their completeness. The evening reports are filed on time, the subunit returns are collated, the ammunition and fuel states are current. This is a division that knows where it is and what it has. What it does not know, what no one on the German side fully appreciates, is the scale of what is gathering beyond the northern horizon. 3 Soviet corps are within striking distance. A tank army is moving into position. The bridgehead is about to become the smallest, most dangerous piece of ground on the entire Eastern Front. The Totenkopf's forward positions face northeast across open steppe. The Soviets have a tank army in the space beyond. The 12th of July is 6 hours away. Chapter 9, 12 July, north of the Psel. The 12th of July, 1943, the most contested date in the Totenkopf's war. And I need to begin this chapter not with the battle itself, but with a single document. A piece of paper that has consumed more of my research time than any other artifact in this project. The Totenkopf's tank status report for the 12th of July, 1943, records 0 armored vehicle losses for the entire day. None. Not one Panzer III, not one Panzer IV, not one Tiger, not one Stug, not one Martyr. 0. The Dupuy Institute's Christopher Lawrence, who has spent years building a comprehensive database of Kursk armored operations, has called this figure hard to believe. I find it impossible to believe. And the reason I find it impossible is that the division's report for the following day, the 13th,
shows a drop of 57 tanks from the 11th of July figures. 57 tanks vanished from the operational rolls in a window of approximately 48 hours, and the report covering the first 24 of those hours claims none of them were lost. Someone lied, or someone filed the report before the day's fighting was over, or the record is corrupt. The truth of the 12th of July is trapped inside this contradiction, and I cannot extract it. The most plausible explanation, and I want to be clear that this is an interpretation, not a fact, is that the 12th of July report was compiled early. German tank status reports, the Panzermeldung, were nominally filed as of 1800 hours each day. If the Totenkopf's report for the 12th was compiled at 1400 or 1500 hours, before the afternoon's heaviest fighting, it would accurately reflect the situation at the moment of compilation, while being wildly inaccurate as a record of the full day. The practice of early filing to meet transmission deadlines was documented across multiple German formations at Kursk. It was not deliberate falsification. It was a bureaucratic shortcut with historiographical consequences, a snapshot taken at the wrong moment, preserved in the archive as if it were a complete record, and cited by historians for decades as evidence of either German invulnerability or German dishonesty. The answer is probably neither. It is probably a clerk trying to meet a deadline. What actually happened on the 12th of July, reconstructed from multiple sources running on 2 different time zones, was this. At 07:15 Berlin time, the Totenkopf's Panzer Battalion took a complex of buildings, identified in the records as barracks, in the vicinity of Kliuchi. This was the opening move, a push northeast from the bridgehead to expand the division's foothold on the plateau. At 09:30 Berlin time, the division's armored group, a combined formation of tanks and assault guns, jumped off from Hill 226.6, advancing northeast. The objective was to extend the bridgehead toward Prokhorovka itself, threatening the town from the north while the Leibstandarte attacked from the southwest. The Soviet 5th Guards Army's records, running on Moscow time, 1 hour ahead, report at 12:15 that 100 tanks attacked from the direction of height 226.6. The Totenkopf had approximately 106 tanks operational that morning. Either the Soviet report is inflated, frontline units routinely overcounted enemy armor, or the division committed virtually its entire armored strength to a single thrust. Lawrence's analysis suggests the actual attack group was probably 70 to 80 tanks. The uncertainty margin is 30 tanks. In a division-level engagement, 30 tanks is the difference between a full-strength assault and a weakened probe. Then came the pivot. At 11:15 Berlin time, roughly 6 hours into the day's fighting, a portion of the Totenkopf's armor was diverted from its northeastern advance and ordered to cross back south over the Psel at Mikhailovka. The purpose, to insert behind the Soviet formations engaged with the Leibstandarte south of the river, striking the Soviet flank and rear. This was a corps-level decision made by Hauser's headquarters, not by Priess. It split the Totenkopf's already limited armor between 2 operations on opposite sides of a river, connected by a single bridge. The tactical logic was sound. Hitting the Soviets from behind while they were engaged frontally could produce disproportionate results. The operational risk was enormous. The division was now fighting in 2 directions simultaneously, with a river between its 2 halves. The Totenkopf armor that crossed south of the Psel ran into the Soviet 18th Tank Corps. The engagement was fierce. Soviet records described the chaos, tanks appearing from an unexpected direction, command posts losing situational awareness, reports degenerating into fragments. The German records, by contrast, are nearly silent on this action. A few lines in the corps-level report. No detailed divisional account. The asymmetry is puzzling. The Soviets clearly noticed the intervention. The Germans barely documented it. One possible explanation: because the southward crossing was ordered by Corps, not by the Totenkopf's own staff. The divisional war diarist recorded it as someone else's operation. The detailed records may exist in the Corps-level files, which have been incompletely exploited by researchers focused on divisional histories. Meanwhile, north of the Psel, the advance continued. At 1500 Berlin time, the Totenkopf's armored group was reported 2 kilometers northwest of Polozhaev, a village north of Prokhorovka. At 1835 Berlin time, the II SS Panzer Corps reported that the Totenkopf's armor was engaged in heavy tank battles approximately 1 kilometer northwest of Polozhaev. This was the farthest northeast the division reached during the entire battle. Soviet records contain a strange observation from 1600 Moscow time. 36 German tanks descended from Hill 226.6 into a depression, moved through a ravine west of Polozhaev, reached Hill 236.7, and then, according to the Soviet report, spent an hour driving back and forth on it before departing into the depression west of the hill. An hour, driving back and forth. This has never been satisfactorily explained. One possibility, the tanks were using the hill as an observation platform, pivoting to establish lines of sight for artillery direction. Another possibility, less comfortable for the German narrative, they were lost. In featureless steppe, with dust reducing visibility to hundreds of meters, a column of tanks driving in circles on a hill is not drama. It is disorientation. When I lay out the day's events on a map, plotting the German positions from the Corps reports on Berlin time and the Soviet reactions from the Army and Corps logs on Moscow time, the picture that emerges is not the clean arrow diagram of a planned operation. It is a swirl. Forces moving in multiple directions simultaneously. An advance northeast that stalls. A detachment south that achieves surprise but is recalled before it can exploit its success. A bridgehead under pressure from 3 Soviet formations. A report that claims 0 losses. And a 24-hour period that consumed, by the next day's accounting, somewhere between 28 and 57 tanks, depending on how you distribute the 2-day total. The 12th of July was not a single battle. It was multiple overlapping engagements fought on both sides of a river by a division that was being pulled apart by conflicting demands. The Totenkopf didn't lose at Prokhorovka. It didn't win at Prokhorovka. It fought a different battle entirely. North of the Psel, south of the Psel, on the bridge between. And the outcome was a bloody stalemate that achieved none of its objectives. The Totenkopf's farthest advance, 1 kilometer northwest of Polozhaev, placed it within striking distance of Prokhorovka from the north. The objective was close. The Corps plan called for the Totenkopf to link up with the Leibstandardt's advance from the southwest, creating a pincer around the town. It didn't happen. Not because of a single dramatic failure, but because the division's combat power was fragmented between 2 banks of a river. Its armor was being attrited by constant engagement, and the Soviet forces in its path, the 52nd Guards, the 95th Guards, elements of the 10th Guards Tank Corps, and the 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade, were too numerous and too stubborn to be swept aside by a division fighting at 2/3 strength. The 12th of July ended with the Totenkopf's positions essentially unchanged from morning. The advance had pushed forward and then receded, like a tide that touches the high water mark and retreats. The 0 loss report sits in the archive like an unexploded mine. I have stared at it longer than any other document in this project. It tells me nothing and everything simultaneously. If it was filed early, it is an honest mistake with dishonest consequences. If it was filed at the proper time and simply omitted losses that had occurred, it is a falsification, not necessarily deliberate, perhaps just the result of subunits failing to report upward in the chaos of a multi-front engagement. If some of the losses captured on the 13th were actually mechanical breakdowns that occurred overnight, engines that finally gave up after 8 days of continuous operation, then the combat losses on the 12th were lower than the 57 tank figure implies, and the division's mechanical fragility accounts for the rest. I cannot resolve this. No one can, without documentation that either doesn't exist or hasn't been found. The 12th of July remains, for the Totenkopf, a day of hard fighting documented by a report that says nothing happened. Night falls over the bridgehead. The tank crews, those still operating, pull back to laager positions. Damaged vehicles sit where they were hit, awaiting recovery. The repair battalion, on the south bank, is already receiving the first towed casualties. The bridge is still standing. Somewhere in a headquarters, a clerk files the Panzer melding. 0 losses. Tomorrow, the 13th of July report will tell a different story entirely. But tonight, on paper, the Totenkopf is intact. On the plateau, in the dark, the truth is something else. Chapter 10. South of the Psel, the Forgotten Fight. The 12th of July, 1943, 14:30 hours, Moscow time. The command post of the Soviet 18th Tank Corps, somewhere behind the lines southeast of Prokhorovka. The operational log, a running record of reports, orders, and observations maintained by the duty officer, contains an entry that has puzzled researchers since the Soviet archives began opening in the 1990s. Enemy tanks in our rear from the direction of the Psel. The entry does not specify how many tanks. It does not identify the unit. It does not explain how German armor appeared behind a Soviet formation that believed it was facing the enemy to its front. It simply notes their presence. And then the log's coherence degrades. Subsequent entries become fragmented, shorter, contradictory. Timestamps overlap. Orders are issued and countermanded within minutes. The format of the document itself tells the story. A command post is losing situational awareness in real time. Overwhelmed by an event it did not anticipate and cannot explain. The event was the Totenkopf's southward crossing. The armor detached from the bridgehead fighting, ordered south by Hauser's Corps headquarters, recrossed the Psel at Mikhailovka, moving behind the Soviet formations that were engaged frontally with the Leibstandarte. The number of tanks involved is uncertain. The Totenkopf's own records barely mention the action. A few lines in the Corps-level situation report, nothing approaching a detailed account. The Soviet records, by contrast, describe a significant engagement. This asymmetry is the defining characteristic of the forgotten fight south of the Psel. The side that was hit documented the impact extensively. The side that delivered the blow barely noted it. The result is a historiographical gap. An action that may have been one of the most tactically significant German moves of the entire 12th of July exists as a footnote in the German sources and a crisis in the Soviet ones. The tactical geometry explains why the intervention was so effective. The Soviet 18th Tank Corps was advancing southwest toward the Leibstandarte, which meant its T-34s were presenting their frontal armor, 90 mm on the turret, 45 on the hull, to the German tanks ahead of them. The Totenkopf's armor, arriving from the north, struck the Corps from behind and from the flank. The T-34's rear hull armor was 45 mm. The Panzer IV's 75 mm KWK-40 could penetrate 85 mm at 1,000 meters. Against a T-34's rear at that range, the penetration-to-protection ratio was approximately 1.9 to 1. Near certainty of a killing hit on any round that struck the hull. The geometry transformed a fair engagement into an ambush. Soviet tanks that had been angled to face the Leibstandarte were now exposed from a direction they hadn't covered. The 18th Tank Corps' after-action report, combined with records from the 29th Tank Corps engaged nearby, indicates total losses of approximately 84 tanks over the 12th and 13th of July. How many of these are attributable specifically to the Totenkopf's rear attack, as opposed to the Leibstandarte's frontal engagement, Soviet mechanical breakdowns, or other causes, is unresolvable. Lawrence's assessment, characteristically honest in its frustration, attributes a significant but unquantifiable portion to the Totenkopf's action. That phrasing, significant but unquantifiable, is the scholarly equivalent of throwing up one's hands. It is also the most accurate statement possible given the available evidence. The records don't allow a precise apportionment. Pretending they do would be invention, not history. What I find genuinely puzzling is the German silence. The Totenkopf barely mentions an action that the Soviets describe as a significant disruption. Several explanations are possible. The southward crossing was a Corps-level order. The Totenkopf's diarist may have recorded it as Hauser's operation, not Priess's, and filed the details under Corps rather than divisional records. The Corps-level files for this specific action may exist in archival holdings that haven't been fully exploited by researchers focused on divisional histories. Or the action may simply have been overshadowed in the Totenkopf's own institutional memory by the more dramatic fighting on the plateau. The bridgehead defense, the push toward Polozhayev, the pressure from 3 Soviet formations, these dominated the division's war diary for the 12th of July. The southward crossing was a detour, a brief excursion, a Corps-directed errand conducted in the middle of the division's own existential battle. It slipped through the cracks of a reporting system overwhelmed by events. Zamelin's work, particularly his reconstruction of the Soviet side of Prokhorovka using previously classified Russian archival material, provides the best available picture of what the Totenkopf's intervention meant for the Soviet counterattack. His analysis suggests the rear attack disrupted the coordination of the 18th Tank Corps' advance, forcing it to deal with a threat behind it, while simultaneously trying to engage the Leibstandarte ahead. This disruption did not destroy the Corps, it disoriented it. And disorientation in an armored engagement has effects that cascade. Units lose contact with their neighbors, radio traffic becomes confused, commanders issue orders based on outdated information. The Totenkopf's intervention didn't need to destroy the 18th Tank Corps to be effective. It needed to break the tempo of the Soviet advance. Based on the Soviet records, it did exactly that. For years, some Soviet accounts of the Prokhorovka fighting described German tanks appearing from impossible directions. These descriptions were dismissed in the older historiography as the fog of war, the confusion of frightened soldiers seeing threats where none existed. They were not confusion, they were accurate reports of the Totenkopf's recrossing. Tanks coming from the direction of the Psel, from behind the Soviet lines, were, from the perspective of a Soviet tank commander oriented southwest, coming from an impossible direction. The old accounts were right. The old historiography was wrong. The revision came decades late, waiting for the archival access that made it possible. The intervention was brief. The Totenkopf armor that crossed south was recalled before nightfall, pulled back across the Psel as the bridgehead on the north bank came under increasing pressure from the 95th Guards and the remnants of the 52nd. The southward detachment had been effective but transient, a jab, not a sustained assault. Hauser chose to recall it because the bridgehead survival took priority over exploitation south of the river. Whether this was the right decision is a question that armchair strategists have debated since, and it depends entirely on what you believe the bridgehead's margin of safety was at that moment. If it was close to collapse, the recall was necessary. If it could have held for another few hours, the southward exploitation might have achieved something more lasting. The records don't give a clear answer. War rarely does. The forgotten fight south of the Psel matters because it is the missing piece in the standard Prokhorovka narrative. The conventional account, Soviet tanks charging the Leibstandarte in a massive head-on collision, is incomplete without the Totenkopf's contribution from the north. The division's intervention disrupted Soviet coordination, exposed Soviet rear armor to flanking fire, and created confusion in Soviet command posts. None of this appears in the popular telling. The Totenkopf fought a battle within the battle, on the wrong side of the river from its own bridgehead, under Corps orders rather than its own initiative, and the results were documented primarily by the enemy it surprised. The forgotten fight is forgotten because the wrong side remembered it. Chapter 11. The Bridgehead Under Siege. The 12th of July, 1943. The bridgehead north of the Psel. While the Totenkopf's armor has been diverted south of the river, the division's infantry, the Panzer Grenadier regiments, is holding the perimeter of a 4-kilometer enclave with no armored support. The 6th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Theodor Eicke, named for the dead founding commander, is the primary formation holding the line. Its situation report for the night of the 12th to 13th of July contains an entry that compresses the entire crisis into a single statistic. Munitionsverbrauch Infanterie Munition, 167%. Ammunition consumption of infantry munitions, 167% of the daily allocation.
The regiment fired nearly twice as many bullets as it was supposed to have. The excess came from the only available source. Living soldiers emptied the ammunition pouches of dead soldiers and redistributed the cartridges. When a unit reports 167% consumption, the mathematics require that someone is collecting from the fallen. The bridgehead was attacked from 3 directions simultaneously. From the west, the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, depleted but unbroken after 8 days of continuous fighting against the Totenkopf, struck the western face of the perimeter. From the north, the 95th Guards Rifle Division, the fresh formation deployed the previous day, launched a full-scale assault. From the east, the 11th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 10th Guards Tank Corps hit the eastern perimeter. 3 Soviet formations converging on a 4-kilometer pocket held by infantry without tanks. The Totenkopf's armor was south of the Psel, doing corps-level work. The infantry left behind had its rifles, its machine guns, its mortars, and the pre-sighted positions it had dug over the previous 48 hours. It did not have the one thing that a Panzer Grenadier regiment is doctrinally designed to fight alongside: panzers. The MG-42, the standard German general-purpose machine gun, was the backbone of the bridgehead defense. Its cyclic rate of fire was 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds per second. A standard belt held 50 rounds, which meant 2.5 seconds of continuous fire before the belt was exhausted. In practice, the gun was fired in short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds to conserve ammunition and manage barrel heat. The barrel would reach cherry-red incandescence after approximately 150 rounds of sustained fire, at which point accuracy degraded catastrophically and the barrel had to be changed. A barrel change, performed by an experienced crew, took approximately 7 seconds. Those 7 seconds of silence, the gun hot, the old barrel being extracted, the new barrel being seated, were the moments when Soviet infantry rushed. The 167% ammunition consumption figure allows a rough calculation of the regiment's MG-42 activity that day. At approximately 5,000 rounds per gun per day, each gun required roughly 33 barrel changes. Each change was 7 seconds of vulnerability. Over a 16-hour fighting day, that's approximately 3.5 minutes per gun of total silence. 3.5 minutes doesn't sound like much. For the men in the trench watching Soviet infantry close the distance during those silences, it was an eternity measured in 7-second intervals. The Theodor Eicke Regiment suffered approximately 423 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, on the 12th and 13th of July in the bridgehead fighting. A loss rate of roughly 15% of the regiment's combat strength in 48 hours. The traditional threshold for infantry combat ineffectiveness is 30%. The regiment was halfway there in 2 days. If the rate had continued, and there was no reason to believe it wouldn't, given the sustained Soviet pressure, the regiment would have crossed the threshold within a week. Combat ineffectiveness doesn't mean the unit ceases to exist. It means the unit can no longer perform its assigned mission without reorganization and reinforcement. An infantry regiment at 70% strength can hold a position. At 50%, it can hold a position if the position is well prepared and the enemy's attacks are unsophisticated. Below 50%, the position holds until it doesn't. The Theodor Eicke Regiment was not yet at that point, but the trajectory was clear. The naming of the regiment deserves a moment's pause. Theodor Eicke, the dead founding commander, the architect of the concentration camp system, the man who codified the Lagerordnung at Dachau. Every time the regiment's designation appeared in a radio transmission, Soviet signals intelligence intercepted the name. The Soviets knew who these men were. Their interrogation protocols for captured Totenkopf soldiers, preserved in Russian archives, included a supplementary questionnaire specifically about service in special facilities, a euphemism for the camps. The Soviet intelligence apparatus understood the Totenkopf's institutional genealogy. When the men of the Theodor Eicke Regiment fought in the bridgehead, they fought under the name of a man who had built Dachau. Whatever else they were, soldiers, defenders,
men fighting for their lives. They carried that name. History doesn't let you choose your inheritance. The armor returned late on the 12th. The Totenkopf tanks, recalled from south of the Psel, recrossed the river, northward this time, back into the bridgehead, and their arrival stabilized the defense. The presence of tanks changes the calculus for attacking infantry. Soviet formations that had been pressing forward against a purely infantry defense now had to contend with direct-fire armored support. The attacks did not stop, but their tempo slowed. The bridgehead contracted but did not collapse. And here we encounter another source conflict. German accounts describe the contraction as straightening the line, a voluntary adjustment to improve defensive positions. Soviet accounts describe it as driving the enemy from the Prokhorovka-Kartashevka road. The difference is between a planned withdrawal and a forced retreat. In my judgment, the Soviet account is closer to the truth. Voluntary withdrawals are planned in advance, with pre-selected positions and coordinated movement. This contraction happened after 48 hours of fighting against 3 Soviet formations. That isn't a plan. That's survival dressed up in operational language. On the 13th of July, under continued pressure, the Totenkopf was pushed back to approximately its 12th of July start lines around Hill 226.6. The bridgehead held. The Soviets did not push the division back into the Psel, but the territorial gains of the previous 2 days evaporated. The farthest advance, 1 kilometer northwest of Polozhayev, was given up. The hill that Soviet tanks had reportedly driven back and forth on for an hour was abandoned. The Totenkopf's high water mark on the north bank of the Psel had been reached and lost in the space of 36 hours. The bridge, the Green Pine Bridge, the 60-ton bridge, the single point of failure, was still standing. The bridgehead still existed, but it was smaller, its garrison was weaker, and its purpose, to serve as the northern arm of a pincer around Prokhorovka, had been functionally negated by the failure to advance far enough. The human cost is captured in numbers that don't need embellishment. 423 casualties in the Theodore Eicke Regiment alone, 167% ammunition consumption, 57 tanks lost across the division in 48 hours. The Pioneer Bridge still standing, still the only way in or out. The repair battalion overwhelmed. 0 tanks returned to duty on the 13th. Every number is a measure of the distance between what the division was supposed to achieve and what it actually survived. The bridgehead didn't fall. This is the accomplishment. It held against 3 Soviet formations, without armor for the critical hours, with infantry burning through ammunition at a rate that required collecting cartridges from the dead. The Totenkopf held its bridgehead because the men in it had nowhere else to go. The river was behind them. The bridge was the only exit, and giving up the position meant being driven into the Psel. Survival is its own form of success. It is not the form that makes it into the victory dispatches. The bridgehead subsides into an uneasy stasis. The attacks diminish in intensity but don't stop entirely. The Totenkopf digs in, improves its positions, waits for repairs that aren't coming fast enough, and replacements that aren't coming at all. The bridge groans under the traffic of supply vehicles bringing forward ammunition to replace what was expended at 167% of allocation. On the north bank, the ground is torn and littered with the debris of 2 days of fighting. On the south bank, the repair battalion works through the night on damaged tanks, racing the next morning's needs. The bridgehead holds. It holds because it has to, and the question now is not whether it can expand. It can't. But how long it must hold before someone in a headquarters far away decides this offensive is over. Chapter 12. 13 July, The Unraveling. The 13th of July, 1943. The Totenkopf's tank status report for this date is the most important single document in the division's Kursk archive. And I want to read it the way the intelligence officer who compiled it would have read it. Line by line, absorbing each figure not as a historical data point, but as a measure of what remained. Panzer III long, 54 on the 11th, 32 on the 13th, down 22. Panzer III observation, 5 on both dates, unchanged because observation tanks carry no guns and generally aren't targeted deliberately. Panzer III Command, 7 on the 11th, 5 on the 13th, down 2. Panzer IV Short, 4 on the 11th, 3 on the 13th, down 1. Panzer IV Long, 26 on the 11th, 14 on the 13th, down 12. Panzer VI Tiger, 10 on the 11th, 0 on the 13th, down 10, 0 operational Tigers. The column reads 0, and the 0 is the most important number in the Totenkopf's war. The Tiger losses require explanation because a 100% loss rate, every Tiger non-operational within 48 hours, is extraordinary even by Kursk standards. The 9th Company entered the battle with either 11 or 10 Tigers, depending on which report you accept. By the 13th, every one was either destroyed, damaged, or broken down. This does not mean every Tiger was a burning wreck on the plateau. The confirmed destroyed count, total write-offs, for the division's entire battle was 18 tanks across all types. Most of the Tiger losses were almost certainly mechanical breakdowns, not combat kills. The Maybach HL-230 P45 engine, after 8 days of near-continuous operation in July heat, with dust clogging the air filters and transmission oil temperatures exceeding design specifications, was at the outer limit of its operational endurance. The critical coolant temperature threshold was 110 degrees Celsius. Contemporary accounts describe Tigers cooking themselves, overheating to the point of engine seizure. Some of the 9th Company's Tigers may not have been lost in any tactical sense. They simply stopped running. The engine couldn't anymore. But the result was the same: 0 operational Tigers on the 13th of July, and a division that had to fight without the one vehicle type that could engage Soviet armor with near impunity at range. The Martyr IIs tell the starkest story: 11 on the 11th, 2 on the 13th, 9 lost in 48 hours, an 82% loss rate, the highest of any vehicle type in the division. The open-topped Martyrs, as I discussed earlier, were desperately vulnerable to indirect fire and blast effects. In the compressed, contested space of the bridgehead fighting, they were exposed to exactly the conditions that maximized their weakness. The 9 lost Martyrs represent 9 crews who fought from open-topped steel boxes, while artillery, mortars, and tank fire swept the bridgehead. Their loss rate was predictable. It was predicted implicitly by the vehicle's own design. The men assigned to Martyr IIs at Kursk were issued a vehicle that the tactical situation would expose to lethal risk, and the 2-day loss rate confirmed what the blueprint already showed. And then there are the Stug 3s. 21 on the 11th, 20 on the 13th, 1 lost. 1. A loss rate of less than 5% in the same 48-hour window that consumed 82% of the Martyrs and 100% of the Tigers. The Stug 3, low profile, well armored for its size, reliable, mechanically simpler than a turreted tank, was the division's most survivable armored vehicle. This data point is counterintuitive. The popular narrative of Kursk is dominated by Tigers and Panzer IVs. The Stug 3 is unglamorous, infantry supporting, ignored. Yet it was the one vehicle that came through the division's worst 48 hours essentially intact. The numbers challenge the mythology that equates armored effectiveness with individual vehicle power. The Tiger was the star. The Stug was the survivor. If I had to choose one vehicle from the Totenkopf's inventory to ride through the Psel bridgehead, I would choose the one that 95% of its crews came back in. The repair situation on the 13th was grim. 0 tanks returned to duty. The repair battalion was overwhelmed. The volume of damaged vehicles arriving from the bridgehead exceeded the workshop's capacity to process them. In the Totenkopf's Kursk record, the repair battalion's output was the invisible engine of the division's combat sustainability. On the 11th, 21 returns in 24 hours. On the 12th, the number is indeterminate because of the contested status report. On the 13th, 0. The workshop had hit its ceiling. There were more broken tanks than there were mechanics, welding sets, and spare parts to fix them. The race between destruction and repair, which the Totenkopf had been winning as recently as the 11th, was now being lost. The total picture, reading the 13th of July report as a whole: 77 operational armored fighting vehicles, down from 134 on the 11th. 57 lost. Of these, only 5 were confirmed destroyed. Total write-offs that would never fight again. The remaining 52 were classified as damaged or broken down. Theoretically repairable, potentially returnable to operational status, but currently sitting in the repair queue or on the battlefield awaiting recovery. A 91% damaged to destroyed ratio. This is an important distinction. The Totenkopf's armor was not being annihilated. It was being eroded. Each lost tank was not necessarily a dead tank. It was a tank temporarily out of action, waiting for a mechanic who might get to it in 12 hours or 72, depending on the backlog. The division's war was a race between the rate of damage and the rate of repair, and on the 13th, damage was winning decisively. To me, the most telling line in the entire report is Panzer VI, null. 0 Tigers. I think about what that number meant not to the statistician in the Corps headquarters, but to the crew of a Panzer III Long, a 23-ton tank with a 50mm gun that could not penetrate the frontal armor of a Soviet KV-1 heavy tank at any range. That Panzer III crew knew the Tigers were their shield. A Tiger could engage a T-34 at 1,500 meters and expect to kill it. A Panzer III had to close to 300 meters or less for a flank shot. When the Tigers went to 0, the Panzer III crews knew they were now the front line against whatever the Soviets sent next. I cannot quantify the psychological effect of that knowledge. I believe it was significant. The absence of the Tigers was felt not just in firepower tables, but in the morale of every crew that had relied on them. The division did not collapse. This is worth stating plainly, because the numbers alone, 57 tanks lost, 0 repaired, strength at 77, sound like a formation in extremis. The Totenkopf continued to fight. It held its contracted bridgehead. Its infantry manned its positions. Its remaining armor conducted defensive operations. 77 tanks was still a substantial force, more than many Wehrmacht infantry divisions possessed in their organic assault gun battalions. The division was hurt, it was not broken. But the gap between hurt and broken was narrowing with every hour of continued combat, and the mechanism of that narrowing, the relentless attrition of damaged vehicles exceeding the repair capacity, had no solution that the divisional commander could implement. Priest couldn't manufacture spare parts, he couldn't conjure mechanics, he could only expend what he had, more slowly, and hope that the operational situation changed before the arithmetic consumed his division. The report was filed, the columns were tallied. The intelligence officer transmitted the figures to Corps, and somewhere in the chain of command, the numbers were received and processed alongside the returns from the Leibstandarte and Das Reich. The II SS Panzer Corps, which had entered Citadel with roughly 494 tanks across 3 divisions, was now fielding approximately 163, 1/3 of its starting strength. The offensive that was supposed to pinch off the Kursk salient was being decided not in the dramatic tank battles that the post-war histories would celebrate, but in the quiet mathematics of daily status reports, columns of numbers that read correctly said, "This is over." Not because of a single defeat, not because of a dramatic collapse, because the tanks were breaking faster than anyone could fix them, and there were no more tanks to send. The report lies in the archive now, in the Bundesarchiv at Freiburg, filed under RS3-3, in a gray, acid-free cardboard box. Box 17, the box that contains the July 43 operational records. On its exterior, someone, an archivist, sometime in the decades since the documents were deposited, has affixed a small yellow post-it note in blue ballpoint. Achtung, unvollständig, Lücken Juli 12 bis 13. Attention, incomplete, gaps July 12 through 13. The records that matter most have holes in them. Whether the gaps are accidental, documents lost in the chaos of retreat, destroyed by fire, misplaced in the fog of archival reorganization,
or deliberate is a question I cannot answer. But the gap itself is information. An absence in an archive is not nothing. It is the shape of something that was taken away. Chapter 13. The Order to Stop. The 13th of July, 1943. A signal arrives at the 2nd SS Panzer Corps headquarters. It is not a battle order. It is not a request for reinforcement or a demand for a situation update. It is, in its bureaucratic precision, something worse than any of those. It is the order to stop. Operation Citadel, the offensive that consumed 9 days, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of lives, is being cancelled. The signal uses a specific German phrase, vorläufig eingestellt, temporarily suspended, not cancelled, not abandoned, temporarily suspended. The adverb vorläufig, temporarily, is the most important word in the document, and it is a lie. The order originated from Hitler's conference with Field Marshal von Manstein and Field Marshal von Kluge on the 13th, prompted by the Allied invasion of Sicily 3 days earlier. The strategic logic, such as it was, held that the Mediterranean crisis required the transfer of experienced formations from the Eastern Front to Italy, and the SS Panzer Divisions were the obvious candidates. The operational logic of Citadel, the idea that the offensive could still succeed, that one more push would crack the Soviet defenses, was subordinated to a crisis on another continent. Whether this was the correct decision is a question that military historians have debated for 80 years. What is not debatable is the effect of the word vorläufig. It implied that the offensive might resume. It never did. But that single adverb gave Paul Hauser and every other senior commander in the 2nd SS Panzer Corps the rhetorical ammunition to argue, for decades after the war, that they were winning when politics pulled them away. Hauser's reaction, as recorded in his post-war interrogation in the ETHINT series, was one of frustration bordering on insubordination. He reportedly argued that the Corps was on the verge of a breakthrough, that one more coordinated push would carry Prokhorovka and justify the entire operation's cost. This claim has been repeated in Waffen-SS veteran literature for decades, and it carries the conviction of a man who believed what he was saying. The problem is, the tank status returns. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the 13th of July fielded approximately 163 operational tanks across 3 divisions, down from roughly 494 at the start. A breakthrough with 1/3 of starting armor strength against Soviet defenses that had been reinforced with a full tank army is not a military operation. It is a fantasy dressed in operational language. The cancellation order filtered down through the Corps to the divisions on the afternoon of the 13th. Priess informed the Totenkopf. The division was instructed to transition to active defense, holding its current positions, conducting local counterattacks as necessary, but ceasing offensive operations. For men who had been attacking for 9 days, who had crossed a river, established a bridgehead, fought off 3 Soviet formations, and pushed to within a kilometer of their objective, the order to stop was a psychological rupture. The Totenkopf's war diary records the transition in flat, procedural language. No editorializing, no commentary, just the new orders and the dispositions to execute them. The diary's silence is louder than any protest would have been. The divisional chaplain's report, or rather, the Feldpost censorship summary that reflects morale indicators drawn from soldiers' outgoing mail, shows a measurable shift after the 13th. The censorship officer noted an increase in letters expressing doubt, requesting rear area transfers, or simply falling silent on the subject of the war's progress. The specific phrase flagged by the system was Zweifel am Endsieg, doubt in final victory. This phrase was a red line indicator in the German censorship apparatus, a marker of failing morale considered serious enough to warrant reporting up the chain. Its appearance in the Totenkopf's mail, an elite, ideologically committed SS formation, signaled something deeper than tactical disappointment. It signaled the beginning of a crack in belief. I cannot read vorläufig eingestellt without irritation. The word temporarily was a fiction the moment it was transmitted. Everyone at Hitler's headquarters understood that Sicily was not a temporary problem.
It was the opening of a second front that would consume German reserves for the rest of the war. But the fiction served a purpose. It allowed the men who had fought and bled for 9 days to believe their sacrifice was not yet wasted. The reckoning would come later, in prisoner of war camps and memoir pages, where the fiction would harden into legend. We were winning. Politics stopped us. This became the central narrative of the Waffen SS veteran community's account of Kursk, repeated in HIAG publications and popular histories until it achieved the status of received wisdom. The tank status returns said otherwise. But by the 1950s, the tank status returns were in archives that nobody was reading, and the memoirs were bestsellers. The Totenkopf was not immediately withdrawn after the cancellation. It continued to hold its bridgehead north of the Psel for several more days while the operational situation was clarified. Another euphemism, meaning higher headquarters hadn't yet decided what to do next. During this limbo period, the repair battalion worked with renewed urgency. Tank strength rose from 77 on the 13th to 97 on the 16th. 20 tanks returned to duty in 3 days. Too late to effect the offensive. Soon enough to matter in the defensive fighting that would follow. The mechanics welded and bolted through the nights, restoring vehicles that would never again advance toward Prokhorovka, but would be needed, desperately, for the retreat that everyone sensed was coming. The fuel expenditure for the entire Citadel period tells a story of strategic waste. The II SS Panzer Corps consumed approximately 3,200 cubic meters of fuel between the 5th and the 16th of July. For scale, that would fill roughly 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Every liter of that fuel was refined, transported across occupied Europe by rail and road, stored in vulnerable fuel dumps, and burned in engines that drove tanks into a salient that the Germans would surrender within weeks. The decision to temporarily suspend the offensive meant that this enormous investment in fuel, in ammunition, in mechanical wear, in human life, purchased a temporary bulge in the Soviet lines that had no lasting operational value. The fuel was gone. The ammunition was gone. The tanks were damaged. The men were dead or exhausted, and the ground they had taken would be given back. The 20th of July brought the final orders. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps would be withdrawn from the line and prepared for transfer. The Totenkopf's bridgehead north of the Psel was quietly evacuated. The tanks recrossing the Green Pine Bridge one last time, southbound now, leaving behind the plateau they had fought for. The bridge itself, the 60-ton bridge, the single point of failure, the structure that had held through artillery fire and tiger crossings, and the doubts of every engineer who knew about the green timber, was demolished by the pioneers who had built it. Standard procedure: deny the enemy a crossing point. The pioneers destroyed their own work. There's something in that act that captures the entire Citadel experience. Build a bridge, fight across it, fight to hold what's on the other side, and then blow it up because none of it mattered. The signal log closes. The Totenkopf moves to its new assembly area. The Kursk salient, which the Germans spent 9 days trying to eliminate, will survive intact. The Soviets will launch their own counteroffensive within days, and the tide that Citadel was supposed to stop will resume its westward flow. The word vorläufig, temporarily, hangs in the archive like an unfinished sentence. The offensive was temporarily suspended. The suspension became permanent. The adverb became a monument to denial. And the division that crossed the Psel, held its bridgehead, and fought to within a kilometer of Prokhorovka, drove south with 97 tanks, and the knowledge that everything it had accomplished in 9 days had been rendered meaningless by a single signal from Berlin. Chapter 14. The Soviet Calculus. The 12th of July, 1943, seen from the other side. The command post of the 5th Guards Tank Army, somewhere behind the Soviet lines east of Prokhorovka. General Pavel Rotmistrov has just committed his entire army, hundreds of tanks, tens of thousands of men, to a counterattack designed to destroy the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Within hours, the results will be clear. They will not be what he expected. And the after-action report he will write in the following days, preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense at Podolsk, will be one of the most remarkable documents of institutional self-assessment produced by any army in the Second World War. Rotmistrov's plan was straightforward in concept and catastrophic in execution. The 5th Guards Tank Army would launch a massed armored assault against the SS Panzer Divisions, overwhelming them with numbers and destroying them in a single day. The army's strength was formidable on paper. Several hundred T-34s, supported by lighter tanks, self-propelled guns, and motorized infantry. The problem was not numbers. The problem was physics. The T-34's 76.2 mm F-34 gun fired the BR-350A armor-piercing round at 655 meters per second, achieving approximately 69 millimeters of penetration at 500 meters against homogeneous rolled armor. The Tiger I's frontal hull armor was 100 millimeters. The math was lethal. At any range beyond roughly 200 meters, the T-34 could not penetrate the Tiger's front. The Soviet solution to this arithmetic was to close the range, to drive the T-34s directly at the German positions at maximum speed, absorbing losses during the approach, and engage at point-blank range where the 76 mm gun could achieve penetration. This tactic has been romanticized in popular accounts as evidence of Soviet courage and aggressive spirit. It was, in fact, a symptom of technological inferiority. The closing distance, the gap between the maximum effective range of the Soviet gun and the minimum range needed for a kill, was a killing ground controlled by the German gunners. The Tiger's 88 mm KWK-36 penetrated 120 mm at 1,000 meters. The T-34's frontal hull armor was 45 mm. Every meter of the approach was a meter inside the Tiger's kill envelope. The losses were staggering. Zamulin's archival research, using previously classified Soviet unit-level records, established that the 5th Guards Tank Army lost approximately 340 tanks and self-propelled guns on the 12th of July alone. Personnel losses for the day totaled 3,563, of whom 1,505 were killed or missing. These figures, drawn from the component units' individual reports and cross-referenced against the Army-level summary, represent the most rigorous accounting currently available. On the cover sheet of Rotmistrov's after-action report to Vatutin, someone, possibly Vatutin's chief of staff, wrote a single word in pencil: proverit. Verify. They couldn't believe the numbers either. The historiographical revolution surrounding Prokhorovka, the process by which the greatest tank battle in history was revealed to be a Soviet tactical disaster rather than a mutual bloodbath, began with Zamulin's work in the early 2000s and accelerated with Wheatley's research from 2019 onward. The old narrative, established by wartime Soviet propaganda and reinforced by Cold War-era official histories, claimed the destruction of 300 to 400 German tanks on the 12th of July. The actual German total armor losses for that day, across the entire 2nd SS Panzer Corps, were probably between 40 and 80 vehicles, and most of those were repairable. The asymmetry is breathtaking. The Soviets lost 340 tanks. The Germans lost perhaps a fifth as many. The greatest tank battle was not a collision of equals. It was a massacre of the attacker. Rotmistrov's personal survival after this disaster was not guaranteed. Stalin's reaction to catastrophic losses was not typically forgiving. Rotmistrov reportedly came close to arrest or worse. The transformation of the Prokhorovka disaster into a propaganda victory occurred over weeks and months, driven by the political need to present the Kursk battle as an unambiguous Soviet triumph, which, strategically, it was. The Germans failed to achieve their objectives. The Soviets held. The initiative passed permanently to the Red Army. But the tactical price of the victory at Prokhorovka was paid almost entirely by one side, and the post-war narrative was constructed to conceal this asymmetry. A Sovinformbureau communiqué from late July claimed over 400 German tanks destroyed. This number had no archival basis. It was printed in Pravda, translated for the Western press, and entered the historical record as fact. I think the word preverit, verify, scrawled on Rotmistrov's report says more about Prokhorovka than any memoir or official history. When your own headquarters doesn't believe your loss figures, the scale of the catastrophe speaks for itself. The Soviet High Command created a special investigative commission to determine whether the attack had been poorly planned, poorly executed, or simply overwhelmed by superior German equipment. The commission's report, partially declassified in the 1990s, blamed inadequate reconnaissance of German defensive positions and minefields. It did not blame German tactical superiority. The Soviets found it institutionally easier to criticize their own preparation than to admit the II SS Panzer Corps, including the Totenkopf, had simply outfought them. The strategic context, however, renders the tactical disaster almost irrelevant. Soviet T-34 production in 1943 was approximately 15,812 units, roughly 43 tanks per day. The 340 T-34s lost at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July could be replaced by Soviet industry in approximately 8 days. The Totenkopf's 57 tanks lost in 48 hours could not be replaced at all.
This is the calculus that ultimately decided the battle and the war. Not who won the engagement on the 12th of July, but who could absorb the losses and keep fighting. The Soviets could. The Germans could not. The production arithmetic was the verdict that no tactical victory could overturn. The Totenkopf itself benefited from the Prokhorovka myth in an unexpected way. Because the dominant narrative focused on the Leibstandart's head-on collision with the 5th Guards Tank Army south of the Psel, the Totenkopf's role, the bridgehead, the Psel crossing, the southward intervention, the desperate defense, was largely forgotten. This obscurity shielded the division from detailed scrutiny. The spotlight fell on the wrong division, and the Totenkopf slipped into historiographical shadow. It would remain there for decades, until archival access and researchers like Lawrence, Zamulin, and Wheatley began reconstructing the battle from primary sources rather than from the myth. Rotmistrov survived. He was not arrested. He continued to command and ended the war as a marshal of armored forces. The 340 tanks he lost on the 12th of July were replaced. The 1,505 men who died were not. Their names exist in Soviet casualty records, filed in the archives at Podolsk, in lists that stretch for pages. The myth that their sacrifice was part of a glorious victory persisted for half a century. The truth, that they died in a failed attack against a force that was better armed, better trained, and better positioned, emerged only when the archives opened. The myth served the state. The truth served the dead. These are not the same thing. Chapter 15. The Myth Machine. Late July 1943. A Sovinform press office somewhere in Moscow. A communiqué is being drafted for distribution to Soviet domestic media and, through diplomatic and press channels, to the Western Allies. The communiqué describes the fighting at Prokhorovka as the greatest tank battle in the history of warfare and claims the destruction of over 400 German tanks. The figure, 400, has no source in any operational report, any unit-level return, any after-action assessment. It is a number created for a press release. It will be printed in Pravda. It will be translated into English. It will enter the historical record. And 80 years later, it will still be cited in popular histories, Wikipedia articles, and television documentaries, as though it were a fact rather than a fabrication. The myth of Prokhorovka was constructed in layers, each reinforcing the last. The first layer was the wartime propaganda. The Sovinform Bureau communiqué, the Pravda articles, the celebratory dispatches that transformed a tactical disaster into a national triumph. This layer was deliberate, produced by professionals whose job was not to report events, but to shape public perception of them. The second layer was the post-war official history, the multi-volume IVOVSS series, produced under party supervision in the 1960s and 70s. The official history drew on the wartime propaganda as source material, treating press releases as primary evidence.
The classified unit-level reports that contradicted the propaganda were sealed in restricted archives. The official narrative was built on a foundation of its own earlier fabrications. The third layer was the most paradoxical, the Waffen-SS veteran counter-myth. German veterans, writing their memoirs through organizations like HIAG in the 1950s and 60s, accepted the Soviet inflation of German losses because it served their own narrative. If the Soviets claimed to have destroyed 400 German tanks, then the Germans must have been fighting against overwhelming odds. If they were fighting against overwhelming odds, then their combat performance was heroic. If their performance was heroic, then they were soldiers, not war criminals. The myth served both sides. The Soviets needed Prokhorovka to be a great victory. The Germans needed it to be a great battle against impossible odds. Both sides inflated the scale for their own purposes, and the inflation became the accepted history. The revisionist correction began in the late 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s and 2010s. Zamulin's work in the Russian archives, using the unit-level records that the IVOVSS authors had been forbidden to cite, revealed the true scale of Soviet losses. Wheatley's research in the German records, the tank status returns, the repair logs, the corps-level situation reports, revealed the true scale of German losses. The two bodies of work converged on the same conclusion. Prokhorovka was not a mutual bloodbath. It was a catastrophic Soviet tactical defeat that was strategically irrelevant because the Soviets could replace their losses and the Germans could not. BBC. Russian reported in 2019 that Soviet military historian Alexei Isayev confirmed Wheatley's assessment of Soviet losses, an extraordinary moment of cross-national scholarly agreement on one of the most politically charged topics in Eastern Front historiography. I am aware, painfully, that deconstructing the Prokhorovka myth carries risks. The 1,505 Soviet soldiers who died on the 12th of July died real deaths. Their sacrifice was genuine. Their courage was real. Reducing their experience to a statistical correction, the losses were mostly on one side, can feel like a diminishment of their humanity. That is not my intention. The argument is not that the Soviet soldiers fought poorly or died pointlessly. The argument is that truth is a better memorial than mythology. Inflating the German losses to make the Soviet sacrifice seem more effective doesn't honor the dead. It obscures what actually happened to them, which was worse than the myth admits. The Totenkopf benefited from the Prokhorovka myth in a way that its officers could never have predicted. Because the standard narrative was dominated by the Leibstandart's engagement south of the Psel, the Totenkopf's entire contribution, the bridgehead, the Psel crossing, the southward intervention, the defense against 3 Soviet formations, was submerged beneath a story that wasn't about them. This obscurity had a secondary effect. It shielded the division from the kind of granular historical scrutiny that might have drawn earlier attention to its concentration camp origins. The spotlight fell on LSSAH. The Totenkopf operated in shadow. And in that shadow, it avoided the detailed examination that Sidnor would not provide until 1977. The myth's durability is itself a subject worth examining. Why did the greatest tank battle narrative persist for so long, despite the availability of contradictory evidence? The answer lies in the incentive structures of Cold War historiography. Soviet historians could not contradict the official narrative without career consequences. Western historians, lacking access to Soviet archives, relied on Soviet official publications as source material for the Soviet side of the story. German veterans had every reason to amplify the myth. The result was an echo chamber in which all 3 parties, Soviet officials, Western academics, and German memoirists, reinforced the same false narrative from different positions and for different reasons. The echo chamber only broke when the Soviet archives opened and independent researchers could check the primary sources against the published accounts. The speed of the myth's construction is itself instructive. From classified disaster to published triumph in approximately 3 weeks. That was the timeline from Rotmistrov's after-action report to the Sovinform Bureau communiqué. 3 weeks to transform a loss of 340 tanks into a victory over 400 German ones. The production of narrative was faster than the production of tanks. This observation resonates beyond 1943. The velocity of modern narrative warfare, where battlefield events are interpreted, framed, and disseminated within hours via social media, makes the Prokhorovka case look almost quaint. But the mechanics are identical. Take an event, strip its context, assign it a meaning that serves your purpose, and repeat the meaning until it displaces the event. The archives at Podolsk hold the truth. The archives at Freiburg hold the truth. The truth is not a single number or a single narrative. It is the messy, contradictory, incomplete pile of unit-level reports, TAG status returns, casualty lists, and interrogation logs that researchers like Zamulin and Wheatley and Lawrence have spent decades excavating. The myth was clean. The truth is dirty. The myth told a story. The truth tells 1,000 fragments of a story that don't quite fit together. I prefer the fragments. They are honest in their incompleteness. The myth was complete and false. The fragments are incomplete and true. I know which one I trust. The myth persists even now, in 26, in popular culture, in lazy journalism, in documentaries that haven't updated their scripts since the 1980s. Every time someone calls Prokhorovka the greatest tank battle in history, they are citing a Pravda press release from 1943. They are not citing an archive. They are not citing a tank status return. They are citing propaganda, and the propaganda is 83 years old, and it was wrong when it was printed, and it is wrong now. The dead deserve better. They deserve the truth of what happened to them, which was harder and uglier and more lopsided than any press release admitted. The myth gave them glory. The truth gives them justice. These are not the same thing, and I will not pretend they are. Chapter 16. After Citadel. Kharkov to the Dnieper. August 1943. The Totenkopf is still in the line. Citadel has been cancelled for 2 weeks, but the division hasn't been withdrawn. It is now fighting a different war, not an offensive aimed at a specific objective, but a defensive struggle against the Soviet counteroffensive that has swept across the entire southern sector of the Eastern Front. The city of Kharkov, the same city the Totenkopf helped recapture in March, is threatened again. The division that was supposed to be transferred to the Mediterranean is instead being ground down in the Ukrainian steppe, trading space for time in a retreat that no one at corps level is willing to call a retreat. The divisional casualty return for August 1943 contains a figure that reframes everything this documentary has presented so far. Total personnel losses for the month, killed, wounded, missing, exceed the Totenkopf's total losses for the entire Citadel period of the 5th through the 16th of July. The July fighting, the mine clearance, the bridgehead, the Psel crossing, the 12th of July, cost the division approximately 3,500 casualties. August cost approximately 4,500. The battle that everyone remembers as the Totenkopf's defining ordeal was, by the cold metric of bodies, less costly than the month that followed it. The column for missing, which on the Eastern Front often meant captured or killed with no body recovered, has been annotated in red ink with an exclamation mark. The medical officer who compiled the report was surprised by his own numbers. The Fourth Battle of Kharkov, the Soviet recapture of the city in late August, required the Totenkopf to defend ground it had taken 5 months earlier at great cost. The psychological dimension of this is difficult to overstate. These men had fought through the streets of Kharkov in March, taken casualties, buried comrades, and believed they had achieved something permanent. Now they were losing it. The ground they had paid for in blood was being given back because the strategic situation had shifted beyond the capacity of any single division or any single army group to influence. The Totenkopf fought well in the defensive battles. Its training, its equipment, and its veteran cadre still gave it advantages in tactical engagements. But tactical excellence could not compensate for strategic collapse. The logistics of retreat impose their own particular cruelties. When a division advances, its repair infrastructure follows. Workshops leapfrog forward, positioning themselves close to the fighting so that damaged vehicles can be recovered, repaired, and returned to the front line quickly. When a division retreats, the repair infrastructure must move backward faster than the front retreats, or it will be overrun. But damaged tanks cannot be towed at the speed of a retreat. Each disabled vehicle became a decision point. Repair it in place and risk it being overrun, or destroy it and save the crew. The disposal reports from August and September read like death certificates for machines. Each entry records a vehicle deliberately destroyed by its own side, charges placed in the engine compartment, a thermite grenade dropped into the fighting compartment, because the alternative was abandoning it intact to the Soviets. The retreat to the Dnieper River, which consumed late August and September, was a continuous running fight. Soviet pressure was relentless. The Totenkopf conducted rearguard actions, short, sharp defensive stands designed to slow the Soviet advance long enough for the main body to withdraw to the next position. Each rearguard action cost men and equipment. Each withdrawal left behind vehicles too damaged to move. The 97 tanks of the 16th of July dwindled. The exact daily figures for August and September are less well documented than the Citadel period. The daily reporting system broke down as the retreat accelerated, but the general trajectory is unmistakable. Downward. Fewer tanks. Fewer men. Fewer options. The Feldpost censorship summary for August records a marked increase in letters expressing Zweifel am Endsieg, doubt in final victory. This phrase, which the censorship system specifically flagged as a morale indicator, appeared with increasing frequency in the Totenkopf's outgoing mail. The division that had entered Citadel with the ideological certainty of an elite SS formation was now producing letters that questioned whether the war could be won. The significance of this cannot be measured in percentages or unit strengths. It is a qualitative shift, a change in the internal narrative that soldiers told themselves about their situation. The Totenkopf was not simply losing tanks and men, it was losing belief. And for an ideologically constituted formation, one built on the premise that will and racial destiny could overcome material disadvantage, the loss of belief was a structural failure more profound than any equipment deficit. When I was compiling the total casualty figures for the July through September period, the sum stopped me. Approximately 8,000 men killed, wounded, missing in 3 months. Roughly half the division's combat strength. The July portion was about 3,500. The August-September portion was about 4,500. The lesser fighting, the retreat, the rearguard actions, the loss of Kharkov, cost more than the Great Battle at Kursk. This inversion of the expected narrative is, to me, one of the most important findings of this project. The Totenkopf's defining experience wasn't the Psel crossing. It was what came after. The division was eventually withdrawn for refitting, redesignated as a full panzer division, the II SS Panzer Division Totenkopf, and rebuilt with replacement personnel and equipment. But the rebuilding was never complete. The veterans of Kursk and Kharkov were diluted by replacements who lacked their experience. The institutional knowledge, the hard-won understanding of how to fight, how to repair, how to survive on the Eastern Front, was eroded by attrition. The division that returned to combat in early 1944 was not the division that had crossed the Psel in July 43. It carried the same name, it flew the same skull insignia, but the men inside the tanks were different, the officers were younger, and the belief that it sustained the formation through Demyansk and Kharkov and Kursk was fraying at its edges. I deliberately chose to compress 3 months into one chapter because that is how the Totenkopf experienced it, a blur. The difference between a structured offensive, Citadel, with its timetables and objectives and daily status reports, and the chaotic retreat is the difference between a story you can footnote and a story that resists narration. The Citadel period has minute-by-minute records. The August retreat has gaps, fragments, and damaged documents. War is not always narratable. Sometimes it is simply endured, and the enduring leaves fewer traces in the archive than the planning. The Totenkopf survived. It would fight on for nearly 2 more years. Through the Korsun Pocket, through the retreat across Poland, through the final apocalyptic battles in Hungary and Austria. It surrendered to American forces in May 1945. The men who survived Kursk were, by then, a tiny fraction of the division's strength. Most were dead, wounded, captured, or transferred. The division that surrendered was Totenkopf in name only. The formation that had crossed the Psel, with its camp guard veterans, its green pine bridge, its 134 tanks, and its letters home that shook with engine vibration, existed only in the archive, in the gray, acid-free boxes at Freiburg, and in the memories of men who would spend the rest of their lives deciding what to remember and what to forget. Chapter 17. The Balance Sheet. The archive at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg, Germany, a reading room with fluorescent lights, gray linoleum floors, and the particular silence of a place where paper is treated with more care than the events it records. The Totenkopf Division's records are stored under file reference RS3-3. The boxes are standard archival housing, acid-free gray cardboard, numbered sequentially. Box 17 contains the July 1943 operational records. On its exterior, someone, an archivist, at some point in the decades since the documents were deposited, has affixed a small yellow post-it note in blue ballpoint pen. Achtung! Unvollständig.
Lücken Juli 12 bis 13.
Attention, incomplete. Gaps July 12 through 13. The records that matter most have holes in them. The Totenkopf entered Operation Citadel with 165 armored fighting vehicles. It ended the battle period, the 5th through the 16th of July, with approximately 98. 18 tanks were confirmed destroyed, total write-offs that would never fight again. 119 were damaged or broken down during the same period. Of those, 68 were repaired and returned to operational status. The division's repair rate, 57% of damaged vehicles returned to duty, was its single greatest operational asset, a capability more decisive than any individual weapon system. But the 18 confirmed destroyed represented approximately 1,035 metric tons of German industrial output, scattered as wreckage across 30 kilometers of Ukrainian steppe. Each of those tons had been mined as ore, smelted into steel, machined into components, assembled in a factory, transported by rail, and crewed by trained men. The Soviet Union could replace its tank losses in days. Germany could not replace these 18 tanks at all. The historiographical debates surrounding the Totenkopf at Kursk remain active and unresolved. The first debate, the actual German tank losses at Prokhorovka, including the Totenkopf's bridgehead fighting, continues to generate scholarly contention. Wheatley's 2019 book and his subsequent 2024 journal article have pushed the estimated German losses sharply downward, while some Russian historians contest his methodology and defend higher figures. The Dupuy Institute's Lawrence occupies a middle position, accepting that the traditional numbers are inflated, while questioning the reliability of specific German daily reports, particularly the Totenkopf's zero-loss return for the 12th of July. This debate is not academic trivia. The numbers determine whether Prokhorovka was a mutual bloodbath, a Soviet disaster, or something in between, and the answer shapes our understanding of the entire Kursk battle. The second debate, the clean Waffen-SS myth and the Totenkopf's criminal origins, has been largely resolved at the scholarly level, but persists in popular culture. Sidnor established the personnel continuity between the camp system and the division in 1977. Subsequent scholarship has reinforced his findings. The debate has shifted from "was there a connection?" settled yes, to "how did the connection manifest operationally?" Did the camp culture make the Totenkopf fight differently, more brutally, more effectively? The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The division committed documented war crimes. It also demonstrated high tactical competence. Whether these two characteristics are related, whether the dehumanization protocols of the camp system produced soldiers who were more willing to fight to extremes, is a question that the historical profession has not fully answered. The third debate, whether the SS divisions at Kursk were genuinely more effective than their Wehrmacht counterparts, touches the Totenkopf directly. The division's repair rate, its defensive tenacity at the Psel bridgehead, and its ability to conduct offensive operations while simultaneously holding a contested perimeter all suggest a high level of organizational competence. But the SS divisions received priority equipment allocation, more tanks, more assault guns, more vehicles per formation than comparable Wehrmacht divisions. Comparing a division with 165 tanks to one with 80 and concluding the first is better is a methodological error. The Totenkopf's performance at Kursk cannot be separated from the material advantages it received by virtue of being an SS formation. Whether its soldiers were intrinsically more capable or simply better equipped is a question that the data cannot definitively resolve. I have spent months with these records, the typed reports, the penciled annotations, the grease pencil maps, the letters home, the post-it warnings on archival boxes. I did not set out to admire the Totenkopf or to condemn it. I set out to understand it. What I found was a military organization of considerable competence, staffed substantially by men whose previous professional experience was operating a system designed to dehumanize and destroy defenseless human beings. That combination, skill and depravity, is not a contradiction. It is the point. The organizational culture that Ike built at Dachau, the obedience, the brutality, the efficiency, the indifference to suffering, translated with remarkable directness into military effectiveness on the Eastern Front. This is not a comfortable finding. It is not supposed to be. The modern resonances are unavoidable, and I won't pretend they aren't present. In August 2024, Ukrainian forces launched an incursion into Russian-held Kursk Oblast, the same region where the Totenkopf fought 81 years earlier. For the first time since 1943, the name Kursk appeared in wartime dispatches describing active combat operations. The terrain is unchanged. The political stakes are different, but the fundamental military reality, that ground must be held, crossed, and fought for by people who bleed, has not changed. This documentary was made in 2026 because the ghosts of 1943 are not ghosts. They are precedents. The questions the Totenkopf story raises, about institutional culture, about the relationship between criminal organizations and military effectiveness, about the gap between what archives say and what actually happened, are not historical curiosities. They are live questions, with live consequences, in a world where war has returned to the fields where the Totenkopf fought. The archivist's post-it note on box 17, incomplete. Gaps July 12 through 13, may be the most honest statement in the entire Totenkopf archive. The records that matter most have holes. Whether those holes are accidental or deliberate is unknowable. What is knowable is that the history of the 3rd SS Totenkopf Division at Kursk is and will remain an incomplete file. Every claim in this documentary is the best approximation available from fragmentary sources. The tank counts are approximations. The casualty figures are approximations. The narrative itself is an approximation, a construction built from the evidence that survived, shaped by the editorial choices of a researcher who decided which fragments mattered most and which could be set aside. I have tried to make those choices transparent. I have tried to show my work. The final ledger: 165 tanks at the start, 98 at the end. 18 destroyed forever, 68 repaired and returned. Approximately 3,500 casualties in 12 days. A bridgehead 4 kilometers wide, held against 3 Soviet formations, connected to the south bank by a single bridge made of green pine. A zero-loss report for the 12th of July that no historian believes. A division born in the concentration camps, forged at Demyansk, blooded at Kharkov, and spent at Kursk. A myth that lasted 80 years and a truth that is still emerging from the archives, one document at a time. The file is incomplete. The gaps remain. The bridge that the pioneers built over the Psel has been gone for 8 decades. But the pencil marks in the records, the blue pencil strikes on the personnel roster, the question mark at Kardashevka, the exclamation point on the casualty return, the word verify on Rotmistrov's report are still there. They are waiting for the next researcher who opens the box and reads the post-it note and decides, despite the gaps, to try. The reading room closes at 5. The fluorescent lights buzz. The boxes go back on the shelves. The archivist locks the door, and the records settle into their acid-free housing, patient and incomplete, holding what they hold and concealing what they conceal, until someone opens them again.